What's up, buddy?
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm wonderful. Good morning.
Good morning. It's quite early over here.
Yeah, apologize. I always feel bad for the early morning meetings and such, but it'll be worth it.
Not at all. It's a great thing. I'm actually very much a morning person. I'm excited. It's just, it caught me a little off guard this morning. I think that Rich must be in Singapore, right?
I do think he's still stateside, but his schedule is crazy. Last time I spoke with him, we did speak about the jet lag and flying back and forth. It's that's a tough schedule he's running right now. I mean, USA and Singapore, culturally different, lifestyle different, training, food, sleep, all that stuff is insane.
Before we get him on, I just wanted to make sure you sent him the email, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I thought in the meantime, I could ask you about something that happened, I guess, last weekend. Unfortunately, I didn't see the fights last weekend, but I heard about this oblique kick topic, the discussion. First of all, can I ask you, why is this, or for the audience that doesn't know, this is a kind of kick. Oh, Rich just joined. Well, maybe you can explain the kick to us, Mike.
So the oblique kick is a side kick, and unfortunately it's a side kick. They call it the oblique kick, but it's normally targeted for the knee. It blows out the knee, it dislocates the joint. And the young man, Khalil Roundtree, is an athlete that I've previously worked with when we were in Las Vegas, when he was on his way up. He's turned into, I think, a superstar now. He's a super talented athlete. That is a completely legal move, though. And I'd love to hear what Rich has to say. It's completely legal. It's allowed. He did absolutely nothing wrong, no disrespect. And you could argue, is that worse than a knee to the face or, an elbow? Who knows? But to see the damage, I think visually speaking, it could be a career ender, but man, any shot in MMA could be a career ender.
Hey, Rich, welcome to the show. We just got started talking before you came on.
Yeah, no worries, man. What's the topic of discussion here? I came in.
I was just asking about the oblique kick topic, the debate that happened this weekend.
I didn't see it. So
maybe Mike can update you.
So what's up, Rich? Good morning, brother.
How you doing, bud? We're just jumping right into this thing. So good morning. Let's get going.
Let's go. So over the weekend, Khalil Roundtree in the UFC, he threw an oblique kick to his opponent and appears like he blew out the kid's knee. Side kick, effectively a side kick to the side of the kid's knee, who was posted in an orthodox stance. Bam, blasted his knee, fight over right then and there. Huge controversy now over Twitter, of course, social media, that it's disrespectful, it's dangerous, it should be banned completely. We had Lieben on last week. I think Lieben had said he'd rather see like stomps to the ground, kind of the old Pride style, as opposed to the oblique kicks. But he did say, hey, it's legal. Now, Lieben is also a referee, kind of working his way up through the ranks now, trying to get to that UFC tier. What do you think?
I've seen these kinds of things before, and I've thought about this kind of stuff actually when I'm competing. There's almost, I guess, in a sense, like a gentleman's agreement of doing these kinds of things or not doing these kinds of things, right, when you're fighting. But what it boils down to is it's a legal kick, right? Particularly if you're fighting an opponent who got some sort of sideways stance that opens them up for that kind of stuff. Because when somebody's standing with that I don't know, maybe it's more of a Tiquando style stance, they're taking a lot of weapons away from you, like a lot of things that you would be able to do because they're pulling the backside of that body away. So you're going to have to be able to do what you can to whatever they have that's exposed. Now with something like that, I personally, I don't think that I could do that, knowing that I could possibly say injure somebody to the point where it would end a career. However, I don't see how it's any different than if I were on the ground and going, like reaping a leg and going for, say, a reverse heel hook or something like that. Because once those things are locked in, I mean, like that, you can tear stuff on a move like that. So I don't see how it's any different. There's just going to be techniques where things are exposed and it can possibly cause injury. And so if this is something that needs to be changed, this is the first time that this has come up, really. But when you think about it, I mean, these type of kicks, like this is kind of, in essence, what Hoist was doing back in UFC 1, right? I mean, with this kind of front stomp setup that he did for the shot at that point in time. And so this is something that you could have seen coming from a mile away, essentially. And, if the public's calling for it, or if the fighters are calling for it, then you have to go back and take a look at the rules. However, I don't think that you can kind of, pass judgment on this guy for just doing what was legal, in essence.
I agree.
Rich, when you say a Taekwondo stance, do you mean like where someone is sort of turned, if they have their right side backwards, they would be turned this way, so their left leg is sort of the knees pointing to the right?
No, you just like when you're standing completely sideways to your opponent. Like typically, if you and I are fighting, right? Like especially if you have a symmetrical matchup, so you're a conventional versus conventional, or a southpaw versus a southpaw, then you're kind of standing somewhat squared to each other, off angled a little bit. But then there are certain athletes, certain fighters, like you see it in boxing all the time, where guys will turn completely sideways, use that front shoulder to kind of cover up, and taking the backside away. Stylistically, these things can become somewhat beneficial in mixed martial arts, but at other times they can become detrimental because it can also limit movement, right? Like somebody who's standing sideways, I don't have to worry about, for example, someone who has a sideways stance, like a Taekwondo stance, taking a shot on me. At the same time, for example, if they're a conventional fighter and they turn completely sideways, it will be very difficult for me to, because I'm southpaw, to like land a solid liver kick. So that whole backside of the body now has been completely taken away. So I'll have to get creative with what I can do to the front side of the body. I mean, perhaps, the lead leg is there more for, single leg takedowns. I'm going to start attacking the lead leg with leg kicks. And in this case, Khalil was the one that threw the kick, right, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah. So then Khalil's obviously attacking the leg that way in a very effective but destructive manner.
So is that position, you mentioned that it's sometimes boxers use it to like hold the side. I guess it's a more less vulnerable side to be hit on. Is it also optimized for the roundhouse kick from the right?
It depends on how you stand, obviously, and stylistically how you move. But if you're, and how much you've actually rotated your body. If in essence I'm standing in front of you and you rotate completely so that we're basically perpendicular to each other, your whole backside is taken away. It's going to be quite difficult for you to turn with that round kick into me with that back leg. You just, because you'll have to open up the hip somehow.
Interesting. Well, Rich, I got to thank you for joining us. I'm sorry to get directly into the conversation. I was just really interested. I don't know that much about MMA, so I'm always asking questions and trying to learn. And I was trying to learn about the oblique kicks. Just to welcome you to the show. I know that you just did a podcast with Mike and you guys are old friends, but Mike and I have a joint podcast here, which we call Biohacking and MMA, sort of because mostly my channel is about longevity and performance enhancement. And so it's about like pharmacology, diet, nutrition, which I know diet and nutrition are things you're very into yourself. And then, so we have this thing together where we started interviewing MMA athletes just last week with Chris Lieben. So you're actually our second guest, which I'm really excited about. I wanted to introduce you to anyone who doesn't know among the audience. You're a UFC Hall of Famer, former middleweight champion, VP of One, and also the CEO of the One Warrior series, which is still ongoing, isn't it?
Well, since COVID kicked in, One Warrior Series has kind of been put on hold for now. So we'll see if that picks back up or not. I definitely have other duties to do for One Championship at the moment. I'm here in the States right now, doing a lot of work with state commissions and stuff like that, traveling around. So yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, I want to mention another thing for the audience to know, and I'll link it down below. You also have a podcast called Quite Franklin, which it's shocking. It has like 16,000 views per video, but the subscribers only 800. So hopefully when people listen to this, they go over there and subscribe to the channel and they can get more access to Are you going to continue making podcasts there?
I am. I enjoy doing it, man. I think, I say this, it's funny how life comes full circle because I went to college. I was trained to be a teacher. I was a high school math teacher for some time. And then of course, my career takes me in the UFC and I'm competing, and you think like I've gone a completely different direction in life, but life ends up coming back full circle again because I really enjoy doing the podcast because I have the ability to disseminate information, impact people, educate people, or just make people think about things. So I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I was surprised that you didn't initially, because a lot of ex-fighters become coaches, and I know obviously you had a lot of opportunities, but I thought maybe even just because of your enjoyment of teaching, you would maybe potentially coach some athletes. Maybe we could get started there. I'm curious why you never got into that much.
Well, first of all, I don't want to own my own school. I've been involved in martial arts schools since, I don't even want to say how long at this point in time. I'm too old to be talking about that kind of stuff. But I've had a lifetime of being involved in martial arts schools, and I know how difficult it is to run a business. I'll give you another example. I'm really passionate about nutrition. So several years ago, I opened up a juice cafe out in Beverly Hills. And I learned very quickly that being passionate about nutrition and disseminating that information is a lot different than running an F&B establishment. And so similarly, what I didn't want to do is open up a school to be able to work with high level athletes, only to, be teaching kids jiu-jitsu classes, cardio, kickboxing, and all the things that actually really pay the bills, because anybody that's listening knows that fighters don't pay the bills. It's just that simple. So that's why I'll occasionally teach a seminar here and there, or oftentimes like George Gurgel was my jiu-jitsu instructor during my career, and he's got a school here nearby. So I'll occasionally pop in and teach a class there or something like that. And I work with people from time to time. So I'm just really at this point in time with my training, I'm just more interested in, getting in the gym and training and getting back to the enjoyment of what got me into martial arts in the first place, is like the pursuit of excellence in a particular art. So when I train, that's what I do.
Rich, since it's your first time here, if I can get a chance to get a bit more background about you. I've listened to so many of your interviews, but I never got a good picture of I know you got into karate very early on growing up in Ohio. But so one thing I've been looking at in fighters, I try to notice whether they grow up in a joint parent households or not. And I would have thought that you would have grown up in a joint parent household, because you're always like a, clean cut, all American kind of profile. But actually you grew up in a split household, I assume, which you've never really talked too much about.
Yeah, I did. My parents divorced when I was 5. I actually had a pretty rough childhood, man, to be real honest, which is kind of surprising to me. Obviously, that kind of socioeconomic demographic is very cyclical with people. People that grow up in that kind of system oftentimes develop like a victimized mentality, and then the system takes you and you continue with that pattern. And so I don't know why, or for whatever reason, I think God had a different purpose for my life, honestly. And not to say that it was particularly fighting, but yeah, I kept myself out of trouble as a kid for whatever reason. I was an honor roll student and basically maintained perfect attendance. I had my fair share of getting in trouble and stuff like that. My mom and we bumped heads quite a few times. But my dad, like for me, I was my family's first child to graduate from college. So yeah, and actually, I think of my siblings, I'm the only one that ever went to university. Now that sounds impressive and all, and I have my thoughts on how important university is for making money and things like that and whatnot, and it can be overrated. But yeah, the whole point is that I was at a young age able to set goals, and then in my mind tell myself, okay, anything that helps me accomplish this goal, I will do. Anything that detracts me from this goal, I will not. So for example, at a young age, I experienced a lot of substance abuse in my family. And that had quite an impact on me. And so to this day, I've never had a sip of alcohol in my life. And initially, I think as a young child, a lot of that had to do with my faith and my upbringing and as a Christian, I guess. My dad did a good job of keeping me in church every other weekend. And when he got remarried, my grandfather by marriage was the minister at the church. And I would say that man pretty much had an impact on my life that probably kept me going down the wrong path in life. But yeah, I would say initially my choice to not drink had a lot to do with that. Then as I witnessed a lot of substance abuse and I got a little bit older in high school, when you start to get to those years of peer pressure and, hey, why don't I give this a try? I think seeing that with some of my older siblings really deterred me. And then in high school, when I got involved into karate and started training, initially it was just, I was never setting out like, I am going to be a UFC champ. I was just doing it to be able to defend myself. But once I got involved in that, I'm like, no, I have a goal here. And my goal is this pursuit of excellence, and this other stuff like alcohol and anything else that's clumped into that thing got in the way. And so it got eliminated.
So you had, there's so many things you touched on there that I'm curious about. So you had faith from an early age, because I know you're a born again Christian and faith is important to you. And I want to talk to you about that in relation to mathematics and science also later, because it's unusual. A lot of people will think that highly educated people or scientists, as all mathematicians are scientists, will think that, they're unlikely to believe in God or be religious people. But for the audience to know, you'd be surprised. There are a lot of top level mathematicians that are actually really religious.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a top level mathematician.
No, I know, but somebody who chooses to study math in undergrad is a person who likes science and logic and rigor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting subject as well.
Okay, so we've touched on a whole bunch of stuff. I touched on a whole bunch of stuff. You just touched on a whole bunch of stuff. And I'll just say this, like, look, you can look at, I'll just give you one example. Look at Ben Stein's interview with Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, one of the leading atheists of the world. Like, and you look at Ben Stein's interview of him, and you keep pressing, like, okay, like if you believe in Darwinian evolution, for example, you can say, okay, well, humans came from this, and this came from this, and this came from this, and it's eventually going to go back to a single cell, which is eventually going to go back to the beginning of the universe. All right. Einstein's theory of relativity proves that the universe actually had a beginning. So if there was a beginning, it's like, well, how did all this thing start? Because there was no matter, there were no laws of science, there were no physical laws, there were no laws of entropy or thermodynamic laws. None of that kind of stuff existed. So natural law couldn't have acted upon nothing to create something, right? Like just by sheer logic, it's like, like for me, I can't wrap my brain around how a person cannot believe in God, because if you have nothing, no natural laws that exist, and then all of a sudden we have all this stuff, then something supernatural had to act upon it to make it happen. Now, whatever you want to call that supernatural force, and in this modern world, people want to get away from calling that supernatural force God. Like they don't want, because you don't want to be held accountable to this thing. Like religion is a system of control and all that kind of stuff, which is a completely different philosophical discussion. But I'm just going to call that supernatural force God. You can call it whatever you want to call it. From that point, you have to decide like who that God is to you. And you know, growing up in a Christian household, I had my years in college where I really questioned my faith, started studying some different things, introduced to a lot of people from different religions, different cultures and stuff like that. It was the first time because I grew up, in where I was kind of somewhat sequestered from those things, right? Neighborhoods that didn't have a lot of cultural diversity. But, you know, once you get back to this logical argument of like, well, how do you explain the beginning of the universe? Listen to Ben Stein interviewing Richard Dawkins just as an example, because he keeps reducing him back to where did that come from? Where did that come from? Where did that come from? And eventually Dawkins reverts to an intelligent design argument. He says, well, perhaps there was a civilization that like an ancient civilization of aliens that was intelligent that created it's like, okay, great. Okay. Maybe we can go with that, but then look, we can still continue with the questioning sequence. Where did that come from? Because you're only kicking the can down the road. Mm-hmm. And so from my perspective, just forget about my upbringing, my faith. I'm like, from a pure logical perspective, like the argument of logic, the proofs that we learn in high school geometry, A leads to B leads to C. It's like, how do you get away from that argument? And you have to rectify that. So
what strikes me about Richard Dawkins is, you know, you would think that the militant atheists would originally have developed this kind of vigor with which they attack religion, because religion was dogmatic and somehow impermissive of their lifestyles. But they end up being, these militant atheists, extremely dogmatic. I don't know if you notice how dogmatic they are in interactions. What I notice is most of their criticisms are of biblical religion's natural tenets, as opposed to the basic principles of those biblical religions. And if you reduce those biblical religions into something like, I'm sure you've came across Spinoza, the Spanish philosopher. They call it Spinoza's God. He has just an approach of looking at God as the founder of the laws of the universe. And so you can look at God sort of scientifically. Albert Einstein said he followed Spinoza's God. If you have that kind of approach, it's much more difficult to dismantle intellectually. You can't find, Richard Dawkins can't dismantle that like he can the 6,000-year-old.
You know, you run into this oftentimes with a lot of atheists who perhaps like people. I'll run into people and you get to talking about religion or whatever. And by the way, like I always say this, like there's a big difference between religion and relationship. You know, religion is man's construct of what a relationship with God. And so, you know, there are people that I talk to, they're like, yeah, well, I don't believe in God because, you know, when I went to church as a kid and then something bad happened, some sort of traumatic experience. The preacher at their church was touching little boys or something like that. And so it's like, well, now I don't believe in God. It's like, okay, great. But that's not technically an argument. Like that's not evidence against God, albeit as human beings, we're imperfect. And that was a person who should not have been in charge of a church or something like that. But it's not an argument against God. And so you have these logical fallacies when you're arguing things and whatnot. But No, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I could talk to you about this with much more length, but I don't want to skip over some other interesting things you mentioned. One was that you saw substance abuse in your youth and decided, I'm never going to partake in this. I'm not going to go down that route. And then you never did, even though I assume in your 20s, maybe in your 30s, you had probably difficult times in your life where you questioned your principles and how your life was going. Did you ever consider then trying drinking, or did you ever end up going that route? And if not, how did you keep your discipline and not question your values? Because I went through this personally. I grew up with alcoholics and I never drank until I was 23 or 22. And somehow my friends convinced me eventually. It took like 7 or 8 years of me hanging out with them drunk. But eventually, so I failed. And I want the audience to know this because we have a lot of younger listeners. I regret that. And I admire, Rich, that you stuck to your principles. What advice could you give young people for that?
Remind me to come back to the principle of discipline on this, because I'm going to forget it as I continue, start to talk here. There was a significant moment in my high school career where I went to a house party. I lived in Southwest Ohio in a little farm community, and so we had those kind of parties that were like, barn parties with bales of hay and bonfires and stuff like that. And we were sitting around, and I remember somebody offering me a drink, and I'm like, nah, I'm cool. And this is high school. So I'm probably about 17 at the time. And this is probably the first time I really encountered real peer pressure. And I'm like, nah. And then finally, because at the age of 17, a lot of kids are already drinking. Like, it's just a normal thing. And so finally, one of the guys on my football team stepped up and said, hey man, look, quit pressuring Rich to take, have that beer. He's like, he's never had a drink of alcohol. And that's really cool. And one of the guys on my football team said that, and it was like he actually admired me in high school at that time. And it just took that one moment where I was like, yeah, man, that's, and just to have that one person back me to be like, nah, you don't have to give into this stuff. And so when that happened, the guy who was offering me beer was like, oh, I didn't realize that's really cool. And so going into college, like, it was just established with my circle of people that they knew. I was all about training. Like, I was going to school, I was studying in math. I was majoring in mathematics, studying. That's not an easy major. So if I wasn't studying, or I wasn't on campus or at the martial arts school training, then I was probably sleeping. That was about all I did in college. Like, but so when I got into college, I became like your best friend because I was your designated driver. So my friends were like, we don't want you to drink. Like, we just want to be able to get home at night. That's pretty much how things went. And so as this applies to the concept of discipline, it never really took any discipline for me to maintain not drinking, right? Like, I'll ask you a question, and it's kind of rhetorical, but have you ever done heroin?
I actually have. I've tried heroin before.
Oh, crap. Well, then
that doesn't work. Yeah, that doesn't work for me.
I haven't.
This is a crazy podcast. Yeah.
Right.
No, but I've never injected heroin, but I did have tried it before.
But I mean, it's like, it's one of those things where, man, my hey, Dolce, have you ever tried heroin?
Never. No.
Okay, so you're messing up my gamble here. But like, man, Dolce, you're very disciplined to have never done heroin before, right? Like, it sounds ridiculous to say that because he has zero interest in trying the substance, right? Like, he doesn't wake up every day craving like, gosh, man, I'm going to fight this urge to not do heroin. Discipline is not abstaining from something that you don't really want to do anyway. Like, I have the discipline to abstain from a lot of things, like whatever. Heroin is another one. Alcohol is another one. But it's not something that I crave on a daily basis.
I didn't think of it in terms of discipline. I was thinking in terms of like never losing belief in your original concept of the world and what's right and wrong. Because sometimes when someone doubts themselves later in life, or, for example, loses a major match or has some kind of identity crisis, they can doubt themselves and say, hey, was I right was I too harsh on myself? Should I try to enjoy life more? That, not the discipline aspect, but the questioning oneself and knowing when you've made the right decision, even early on in life.
Well, okay. So first of all, alcohol for me is not a right or wrong decision. You can drink alcohol, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I mean, even biblically, if we want to go down a biblical route, I don't believe that drinking alcohol is necessarily a bad thing. Being drunk is a completely different situation. But the Bible doesn't necessarily condemn the consumption of alcohol.
Yeah.
drunkenness, it will. So I'm not going to argue from a religious standpoint or from a faith-based standpoint, I should say, that you shouldn't drink, because I don't necessarily believe that. That's a whole different thing. So it was never founded on that. It was founded on the fact that I want to accomplish goals in life. Those goals just happen to be mutually exclusive from drinking alcohol. So it's not about like losing, my sight of what's right or wrong, but it's about losing vision of what I'm trying to accomplish in life. And as far as lapsing into trying alcohol in moments of depression and stuff like that, like even when I lost my title, which the night that I lost my title, I fought Anderson Silva in Mandalay Bay, and I sat at the hotel, the hotel branch of the Mandalay Bay, up on like the 28th floor or something like that, staring at Interstate 5 until the sun came up, asking myself, like, how did I get here?
That story from your TED Talk is actually about the Anderson Silva loss?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know if it was a different loss. Oh, I wanted to know how you felt that night. Oh.
So even at that moment, which was probably one of the lowest moments in my career, but I'll just say this, as a lowest moment in my career is in like comparative terms, not as low of a moment as things like my father passing away, right? Like keeping things into perspective, right? And so when it comes down to something like that, never did I ever think like, man, a beer would help me right here, or some drinks just to take the edge off, because how does that solve anything? Right? All I'm doing at that point in time is losing vision of my goal. So you see this oftentimes with athletes, and the reason why is because your identity is wrapped up in that very thing that was taken away from you. And my identity has never been wrapped up in that. Like for example, you brought up my podcast earlier. If you listen to my podcast, it's not an MMA podcast. I'm not an MMA coach. Right? Like you even said that, like, I'm surprised you didn't coach mixed martial arts. My job for One Championship is based on MMA, I guess you could say, but that's because I've built a lot of equity in this industry. However, I'm much more than an MMA fighter. And so if you pull that aspect of my life away from me, I have many other things to fall back on that defines who I am. I'm an intelligent person. I have tons of other things. I can only come up with one, apparently, in my examples there with me being intelligent. And that's a suspect statement at this point too. But all that is to say that I didn't wrap my identity up in that. So I'm never questioning who I am. And honestly, probably a lot of that as well is me falling back on my relationship with Christ. In these moments of hard times for me, it's like, man, like what's going on here? And I've had some tough times in my life where I'm like, really, like, God, come on, man. Like
now, Rich, we've been touching on some deep topics here, but I have a more amusing question about your youth. So I know you got into karate early on.
Yes.
And I know very little about MMA, but I was also like you as a youth. I was into martial arts. So I was doing karate, kung fu, taekwondo, things like that. And I wanted to ask you, because I also know Bloodsport had a huge impact on your childhood. So for those that don't know, Bloodsport is a movie by Jean-Claude Van Damme about a guy called Frank Dukes. Apparently it's based on a guy called Frank Dukes, who Rich later met. And you've never actually went into that much detail about meeting him. So I was curious about that. But first I wanted to ask you something. So growing up in the 80s, 90s era, when MMA wasn't fully, and even when you competed, it wasn't fully developed into what it is today. Yep. That we lived at a time in the early 90s and at least in the 80s where there were people doing like 1-inch punches, and you couldn't really know when you were a child, reading books about martial arts, what was effective in combat and what wasn't. So I was curious to know your experience in karate as a youth. I know later you did wrestling, and then I think in college you got into Brazilian jiu-jitsu, boxing, and Muay Thai properly. But how did the karate influence your later fighting? Did it mislead you? Did it not only was it not optimal, but did it mislead you in some ways? Because a lot of the katas are not very useful. And when we were taught back then, we were taught that this is like completely practical.
Well, I'll say this, right? Like, it's kind of like Bruce Lee's philosophy. He's going to take what works and then he's going to get rid of what doesn't. So you can look at any system. Let's take boxing, for example. In the art of boxing, there are things for mixed martial arts that will work, and there are things for mixed martial arts that will not work. When I started initially working with a boxing coach, my boxing coach had me throwing like lead hooks that would leave my entire front side exposed, like turning the hips over, committing to a punch as it applies to mixed martial arts. These kinds of things leave you open for shots and stuff like that. So as I was working with my boxing coach, there was a lot of technique that we had to kind of, manipulate or whatever in order to fit so that it would fit for mixed martial arts, as well as like when you're throwing punches, to be able to set up shots off of punches is much different than say a boxer would. You can, we talked about that shoulder at the beginning and that kind of lean back style, like something like a Floyd Mayweather's type of style of boxing where you can lean back and do all that movement. These things are great until somebody suddenly throw cut kicks at your head and you're going to get kicked in the face. So when I'm working with a boxing coach, for example, I have to eliminate all these aspects of boxing that don't work well for me. Now, as this applies to my original training in karate, much is the same. If I'm going to take that Bruce Lee mentality, I got to use what works and I got to get rid of what doesn't work. Just to give you an example, I think one of the things that karate did for me, because I did an Okinawan style Shornryu Matsubayashi-ryu karate, and just side story on that. Recently, I did a seminar for. I'm helping this young man walk across the country who had cancer and was told he would never walk again. And so I did this seminar here outside of Cincinnati with myself, Matt Brown, Matt Hamill, and Mark Coleman. Really cool. It was just to raise money for this cause. And my karate instructor from high school actually came and took my seminar. And I thought, wow, it's kind of cool how life just circles back around. But anyway, like when I was training karate, for example, one of the things that karate really helped me with was when I'm moving, like as you're moving and you're throwing those traditional punches, which you can't see me doing here unless those traditional, kind of punches, right? As I was learning that, like you walk and you step as you're punching. Well, you never walk, for example, in boxing. But what that concept taught me was a lot of power and hip movement. So I had the ability, for example, I'm naturally a right-handed guy predominantly. I do some things left-handed and I fight left-handed. And I fight left-handed because karate taught me how to lock in my hip on those punches and move with the shoulder, the hip, those whole body mechanics very, very well. And when I started doing boxing, like when I started doing mixed martial arts, I was at times when I was doing my striking, like I would flow back and forth, or at least try to, between my stances. And what I realized was that I move way better as a southpaw than I do as a conventional person. And even though my right hand is probably technically stronger, at least, if I want to throw a ball or something like that, I realized like I can probably teach my left hand how to hit hard enough that I can take advantage of being able to move really well. So karate taught me a lot of these concepts, like the overall system, the katas and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, not very useful for fighting, but there were a lot of like small details and concepts that really transitioned over. Along those lines, also, I worked out in a martial arts school that was like it was like our karate school was hardcore. Like it was a hard training sessions. I mean, hard training sessions. Like we'd sit there and stand in these hourglass stances for like, hours, like building up our legs and stuff like that. And it would just,
is that the horse stance they call it?
Yeah.
I hated that.
Yeah. All that.
So sometimes I sit with my wife. Well, obviously I don't know much about fighting, right? But I did all that stuff as a kid. So sometimes my wife and we watch the UFC fights and I tell her, I used to sit for like an hour in this horse stance in the Shaolin Kung Fu. I don't know what it would do for me in a fight now. I have no idea. So, but you didn't mind that stuff, huh?
If nothing else, it's mental dexterity. Like I had the ability, I would go in and I can remember working katas, and I would come in and I would do like the first move of the kata, and I would do this move 500 times type of thing, like just over and over. I'd be the last guy on the mat, or it was a deck. It was an actual wooden deck, but I'd be the last guy in the school, and I'd be doing these moves and spending hours doing this stuff. And if nothing else, it taught me mental dexterity that would pay off later when I was doing jujitsu and boxing and things like that, because I had that work ethic instilled in me. So it gave me a lot of that. That's the foundation that I needed, that when I transitioned into other martial arts, like jujitsu, like wrestling, like, boxing and kickboxing and stuff like that, that I had these, if it wasn't the mental fortitude to be able to start back over. Because think about this, man. And I've experienced this many times. I was a black belt in karate. I was like my sensei's number one student, right? Like I was the Johnny Lawrence of Cobra Kai in essence. and then suddenly I'm going to go to this jujitsu school where I'm just getting mopped up on them. Like they're basically taking me and doing this on the mat. Like, yeah. And so I had to start back over. And then even when I started fighting and climbing the ranks, and I had become somewhat of an accomplished fighter, maybe hadn't made it to the UFC yet or anything like that, but had garnered some recognition within the ranks of people who knew as I was coming up. I had to start wrestling because I didn't wrestle in high school, being from Ohio. And a lot of people think that I wrestled. Oh. I never wrestled. And so I literally had to pay for it, like literally pay money to learn all the wrestling that I could have learned in high school. And I had to start back over again where after I was a fairly accomplished jiu-jitsu player, but I could play off my back real well, but I didn't understand the game of wrestling. So now suddenly I'm like, well, okay, now I'm pretty good at fighting, right? Like I got these, I'm doing boxing. I got this jiu-jitsu. I have this background in karate. I'm going to this wrestling school and now I'm getting mopped up on the mats again. And I had to start all back over. And I wholeheartedly believe that my beginnings in karate, in that traditional karate I did, gave me the mental fortitude to be able to keep starting back over to do those things.
Rich, can I just jump in and ask a question? When you started, mixed martial arts was very polarized and it was very independent. You had your karate guy, you had your boxers, you had your Muay Thai fighters, you had your gi jiu-jitsu guys, even back in those early days, right? No gi was not quite a thing. And so you had these segmented sports, and inside those segmented sports, there was the concept of this is our style. You train in our gym with our athletes. You don't go to the similar gym across the street, across town. You don't train with those guys. You don't share our technique with them. Did you have, because you floated not just from different gyms to completely different arts, did you have any pushback from your coach, from your teammates? Did you find it hard in order to get that additional cross training, as now we now know? And you were one of the first cross-trained athletes, I say truly trained cross-trained athletes, guys like you, guys like George St. Pierre. You changed the sport, from my opinion, standing outside, doing what I do. You certainly set the template that I think most athletes follow now, and it was rather brave in kicking off. But did you have pushback, especially back in those early days where now it's not a big deal? You have cross-trained MMA gyms, anyone comes in. But what was your experience like coming through that?
Well, okay. So first of all, you talk about doing things differently and being kind of on that cutting edge. I mean, as the saying goes, if you do the same things that other people do, you're going to get the same results that they get, right? And so you have to constantly be thinking outside of the box. Keep in mind that my generation of athletes really was that first generation of true mixed martial artists, if you want to call them that, right? I mean, maybe you had Ken Shamrock early on, who was a shoot fighter or something like that. But most of the athletes in the UFC at that point in time were stylistically one or the other. Now, I'll say this: when you talk about the polarization or whatever, as I trained, my training was I would go to a separate boxing coach. I had a kickboxing coach. I had a wrestling coach. I had my jiu-jitsu coach. And then I had a strength and conditioning coach at a different gym. So I was going to all these different facilities all the time. And I had to travel all over the city in order to get to these places. So I never had any pushback in between any of these guys. Well, other than, look, anytime you run a camp, you're going to there's always drama in a camp, and some people get along at times and other times they don't and whatever. And you have those kinds of things, but there was never any kind of issues with people necessarily stepping on each other's toes, because I went to the power station here in Cincinnati. Mike was my strength and conditioning coach, and everybody knew that Mike ran the show with my strength and conditioning. There's the show when they did the All Access on me with Rochelle Leah years ago. People saw that workout that you're probably referring to, Mike, that we did in the gym, where we just did this circuit. And we took that, and that was like our infancy stages of this whole cross training that we did. And as time went on, things became, I'll use the word functional, because we think of like things like tire flipping as functional, when we can get into what the definition of functional is, because tire flipping makes you good at tire flipping. We in this modern world, we suddenly became like, well, actual deadlifting with a bar is not functional, but tire flipping is. Like,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Don't get me started on this whole functionality thing. But either way, like the workouts had more of those functional, I keep using the quote marks here for anybody that's just listening to audio on this, exercises in it. And we really did construct those. And I can get into what we did with these kinds of things to mimic what a fight would really look like. But his role was that, and it was clearly defined. And George's role was the BJJ, and Neil Rowe was my kickboxing coach, and Rob Radford was my boxing coach. And then I worked with some wrestlers like at a local college here at Mount St. Joe. I began working with a guy named Ryan Root at some point in time. I had a couple different wrestling coaches that I worked with, but it wasn't until midway through my career, Mike, that I started working with Matt Hume up in Seattle. Him and Joel Jamieson up there did my strength and conditioning. And that's the first time where I ever worked in a facility that was kind of all inclusive. But of course, the resources like that, like the people that have that kind of knowledge of MMA just really didn't exist. So I'll say this, as it applies to training, like you can, I believe that in this modern landscape, people talk about the evolution of something and how things have gotten better. I actually think that this modern landscape of mixed martial arts schools where everybody comes in and does everything, on one hand can be very, very beneficial to the quality of athlete, but on the other hand can be quite detrimental to the quality of the athlete, because I believe that there is value in going into a boxing school and working just pure boxing. I believe that there is value in going into a jiu-jitsu school and working just pure, BJJ. And so there are times in my career where it's like, okay, I'm going to go and do this BJJ class. And then now I'm going to go and do this mixed martial arts session. I'm going to go and do this boxing class. Now I'm going to go do my strength and conditioning. Oh, now I'm going to go to this other mixed martial arts session. So my group or my team at that time was kind of this combination of old school separated arts and the new school mixed martial arts. So we dedicated time to the separate arts and time to putting it all together. And I, to this day, if I was a modern day athlete, I believe that I would still train that way. I wouldn't go to a school that was just only MMA.
Can we dig a little bit more into this, the history of like how the UFC competition became more evolved into a more professional combined mixed martial art training? Specifically, I wanted to ask is, I think that in 2002 or 3 was when you started at the UFC. It was the end of your regional competitions, right? So around that time, the UFC had been operating for a couple of years, or MMA fights had been. Were there still fighters going into the UFC that were one discipline only fighters? Or were most people trying to mix and match? And this is my second question in regard to that is, when you were mixing and matching, like for example, you mentioned now you had an MMA trainer or a mixed guy later on. You mentioned Matt Hume, the Wizard Hume, who also trained Chris Lieben. But before that, when you would go to your boxing coach and then your Muay Thai coach or your kickboxing coach, would you have to mentally think like, how am I going to combine the different styles of punching for my actual mixed martial art fight? Or would your two coaches have an understanding of like, this is maybe how you should use the boxing in the ring?
Yeah, no,
figuring it out on your own?
Yeah, when I first started working with my boxing coach, he had zero experience in MMA. Okay. And so when I went there, he would say, okay, like I threw a hook, and he tells this funny story. Like I walked into his gym. It's a boxing gym, right? Like boxing gyms always end up in like the bad part of town. And so I walk into this gym, and I had been referred to him. And so I come down there, I'm like, and I said, hey, Rob, I would like to, start doing some boxing. He's like, okay. And I'm like, look, I don't know what your hourly rates are. I don't know how much I can afford, but, and I was like telling him my plan. Now this is back before I've like actually made a name for myself. I said, but I'm a fighter. So if you wanted to set something up where you take a percentage of my purse and instead, and he just kind of looked at me, he's like, yeah, I'll take the hourly rate.
Well, he messed up there, didn't he?
Right. That's what he says that too. He says that. So it's a funny story, because like, yeah, I just didn't at the time. Like, I mean, you look at me now, like, I was a little thinner. I just didn't look like a fighter, I guess, maybe. And he was like, yeah, I'll take the hourly rate. Now, when you look at me, it's like, you can tell I've probably been through a couple wars in my life or something like that for sure. But yeah, I don't. I got sidetracked on that story. What did you?
The first part of that question was: were there guys though coming into the ring in 2002 that were still one discipline guys?
I would think so. I would think that was the beginning of the transition, right? Because I think that around that 2002 timeframe is where you had guys like me who were saying, like, look, you look at a guy like there was a time where BJJ ruled. And then there was a time, like, for example, where wrestling ruled. Yeah,
right after, yeah.
Because the wrestlers figured out how to not get submitted, but they were just still wrestlers. They were like, well, now we know how to not get submitted.
Yeah, and Randy Couture. Yeah. Randy was dominating at that time, but he was still one discipline. He was just a Greco dude, right? Cage, wall and brawl. That's what they called this style, right?
Yeah, but then, and Randy's a great example. Like Randy, his boxing, like, if you want to compare it to boxing, is crap. Like, he doesn't have good boxing, but dude, Randy quickly learned how to integrate his boxing in with his wrestling. And that's what makes him really, really effective. Similarly for me, like, I'm not a great wrestler. Put me on a mat with an NCAA champ that just wrestles, right? Like, and all I can do is wrestle. Man, dude, I'm going to get smoked on that mat. Give me a jab. Just give me a jab. Give me a jab. And it levels the playing field really quickly, because now my jab is my setup for my shots. My jab is my defense to keeping him from coming in, because it's a different game. But initially, somebody like Randy, who was able to say, oh, look, I'm a wrestler and I'm going to learn these other disciplines like boxing, like even his ground game, like, his submission game is pretty good for a wrestler, we'll say. But yeah, like he learned how to complement all these things with his style. Now, the next phase of that was like somebody like myself, who basically looked at like a Randy Couture, who was just a few years before me in this, and said, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Like somebody's going to take the fight to where I'm the weakest, or at least that's what I would do. Talking about mathematics, like this is how my math would apply to my training and preparation. When I was getting ready for an athlete, what I would do is I'd basically set up like a matrix, a thought matrix of like, here, like on the x-axis, here's my strengths and here's my weaknesses on the y-axis. And then I would take my opponent and I would say, okay, here's his strengths and here's his weaknesses on an XY axis, and create this matrix and see like where my strengths matched up with his strengths, where my weaknesses matched up with his weaknesses, and so on and so forth, and do an evaluation that way, and basically create a path of least resistance. And that's how I did my game plans. And it was a very like mathematical way of thinking, fighting. And so that's what I did. But I took this mentality, this approach of like, well, look, I'm only as strong as my weakest link. So I can't just be a karate guy or a good striker who has jujitsu that's good enough to survive. I wanted to be as good at jujitsu as I was at karate or at boxing or whatever. And so I think that that's the mentality that I learned, that initial mentality that we talked about from my days in karate, is like, no, I'm on the pursuit of excellence here. And this is one of the things, like, just as things come back around full circle, like yesterday I went into the gym, and I'll probably go into the gym today, do a little bag work or something like that. But I went into the gym yesterday to do some bag work, and I'm working these specific foot drills with the bag where I'm throwing this jab and I'm double slipping off the jab and then countering. So I'll double slip outside, inside, and counter with the rear hand as I'm, cause my hip's loaded. And then I'll double jab and slip inside, outside, and counter with the lead hook. But it's about moving my feet so that my feet are always underneath me. Mm-hmm. And I'm in the gym yesterday working this like specific detail. Why? Like, who am I going to fight? Like, I don't have any scheduled fight. I don't have any planned scheduled fight. And if I were to get in a fight on the street, like, I don't think I really need to work these footwork drills in order to do these kinds of things. But this mentality of like, no, this is what I do. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to pursue it to be as excellent as I possibly can. And that was ingrained in me from the beginning. And so that applied to my mixed martial arts training throughout my entire career, which is what made me as well-rounded of an athlete as I could be, given the resources that I had here in Cincinnati.
Rich, you touched on so many topics that are very interesting. I'll just start with the last one, talking about the training that you're doing right now. I've heard you mention in interviews that after you retired formally and didn't have that pressure of sponsorships and so on, which was sort of disguising a hobby originally, which was a hobby or a passion of yours that you loved and that you pursued mainly out of love for it. So right now, I think you're maybe getting back into enjoying it as opposed to feeling those pressures and so on. What I wanted to ask you is this. You made a very interesting choice, and we skipped around a bit, but you made a very interesting choice when you decided in 2002 to formally go be a professional fighter. What did you make that choice? Because it's interesting. I think a lot of fighters make that choice because of a lack of alternatives and maybe other situations. You had a perfectly designed, risk-averse lifestyle, doing probably something you also loved, which was teaching, in a subject area that nobody studies unless they also love it. So it was something that you liked, and you decided to take a really different path with that as a backup. Did you do this out of just the love of the sport of what you were doing? Or did it have something to do with proving yourself, making a name for yourself? Was it ego-driven or purely out of love for what you were doing? And then how did you work it out with your father, which I think is an interesting story also?
First of all, you talk about risk aversion. You need to know me in order to understand that I am just anti-risk aversion. I tell people this: if I was a cat and I had 9 lives, I've probably burned 8 of them at this point in time. Like, I do some of the dumbest stuff, man. Like, I've driven off of like car crashes I've had. I've driven off a mountain on a quad runner, almost killed myself, like right in front of my friend's eyes. Like, so when you talk about risk aversion, like
the reason why I said risk, let me just explain, because I was thinking, I was trying to get in your psychology, and I was thinking so actually let's talk about this briefly. How did you decide to major in math originally in undergrad? Because it's so unusual. coming from a difficult background, not a stable home or family home life, most people that aren't introduced to math in just the best way possible don't fall in love with it. Did you naturally fall in love with it? And then when you decided to major in it, usually people who major in math in undergrad will tend to want to do PhDs or become research academics. That's where I thought you might be risk averse. I said, hey, why didn't he go into research? Or maybe he wanted something stable and wanted to teach high schools as opposed to college students. Maybe
I'm quite the conundrum, right? Like,
yeah, you are very interesting. Well, you are. Think about it. You must be the greatest fighter in history with the most amount of math knowledge in one person. You're probably in all of human history, the guy who knows the most math that can fight the best, which is very cool.
I'll take that title. Yeah. So no, I don't know. I fell in love with math at a young age, and it was something that I was just good at. And I think that if I lived in a stable home, so going back to my upbringing, my mom and dad divorced when I was 5. From the time I was in kindergarten to the time I graduated high school, I was in 13 different schools. And so had I not bounced around as much as I did, I probably could have been a much smarter mathematician, because like anything else, a sport or anything, you have to cultivate that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I could have been doing these things at a young age. And so I was just good at math. The only reason why I majored in mathematics and education is because I chose math because I was good at it. I do enjoy math. I tell people this: I enjoy math. I enjoy teaching. I don't enjoy teaching math. And then I meaning to that. All right. So, but what happened to me is I transferred high schools, and when I was in high school, between my sophomore and junior year, I moved to a new high school and I moved from the state of Kentucky to the state of Ohio. There was a requirement for graduation speech that most people take when they're sophomores. So my senior year, I ended up having to make up this credit that I needed. It was an English credit in speech. And one day we gave a speech in this class. It was an unprepared speech where we took pens and we wrote down a topic on a piece of paper and put it in a hat. And then the kids in the class, we all randomly drew a topic. And without preparation, we had to go up and just give a speech on this thing. Yeah. So I draw my topic and I open this thing and it says algebra. I'm like, fuck. Like, what? I gotta go up and give like a 3-minute speech on algebra. So I go up, and you remember those pull down things where they took the chalk erasers with the dots in it and you could create a grid on the chalkboard. So my speech teacher had one of those. So I drop it down and I create this grid, and I draw my XY axis and I create my XY chart. And I start explaining everybody to the class on how to graph a line. I'm talking about slope, intercept, and all these concepts that we learned in basic algebra. And then suddenly, like I'm like 2 minutes, 3 minutes into this thing. And then somebody's hand goes up, and I'm like, Daryl? And he says, so you're telling me, and then he asks this question, and then I'm like, yeah. And so I turn around and I start explaining it. And then suddenly another hand goes up, and I'm like, Rodney? And he's like, these are guys on my football team, right? And he's like, so you're, and I'm like, yeah. And so my teacher, she lets us go on for about 15 minutes. And then finally she's like, look, I got to stop this. And so she pulls me aside after class. She's like, actually, she said, I think you have a knack for teaching people, and it's something that you should consider. And I'm like, I don't know what I want to do in life. Like, I didn't know. I didn't have my dad was pushing me into the medical field because I was his smart kid. And that was like going into medicine was the escape from poverty that we grew up in. And so,
that's the risk averse option. Okay.
Yeah. Right. That was my dad. And I'm like, but in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to do like resident, and I don't want to be a doctor working like 90 hours a week. That's not what I want to do. And to me, teaching was like, I'm apparently good at this, and I like math, and I get summers off and spring vacation and, winter vacation. Like this is not a bad gig. And so that side of my brain said, no, I'm going to choose this. Money isn't really as important to me. I got thoughts on that, on university, that we can talk about maybe later if you want. But yeah, so I majored in that. And then I came out with my degree in education. My father and I actually graduated college at the same time, because he went back to school. And this is why, touching on my dad, this is why it was a big deal to him, because we graduated the same year. I can't remember if it was my undergrad, because I had two. I don't remember. Technically, I had 2 undergrad degrees. They were back to back because I was in a 5-year program. So I don't remember which of my 2 years that he graduated with, but it was one of those 2 years. And then later on, subsequently finished my master's in education. But so when I came to him at that time, like, yeah, I had a very risk adverse job. I had the makings for the 2.4 kids, the 1.7 dogs, the white picket fence, and the Toyota Camry. And that life was exactly, this is how people start, right? But I found myself, and I had already made the decision to leave teaching prior to this, but I found myself living in this neighborhood where, Tom on my left had his Toyota Camry and Bob on my right had his Honda Accord, and all the houses looked the same. It was cookie cutter. And, I'm like, man, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do that life. And so talking about risk aversion, like outside in my normal life, like I'm constantly doing dumb stuff. Like I still go snowboarding or wakeboarding and I treat myself like I'm a 13-year-old kid. Right. Except the only problem is when I wipe out now, I don't get up as quickly as a 13-year-old kid anymore. And right, like, just age sets in. Right. But I still try stupid stuff. Like I'm going to try this jump and hit this 360 and see if I can pull this thing off. And so anyway, I grew up my entire life, man. I grew up playing football from the time I was in the third grade when I was 8 years old till the time I graduated. I did not have the God-given talent to play that sport. If you saw a picture of me in high school, you would literally not believe your eyes. I graduated my senior year at 157 pounds, dripping wet.
That's 6'1"?
6 foot tall. I actually hit a growth spurt my freshman year of college. I grew another inch, and from my senior year of high school till about midway through my sophomore year, I put on about 40 pounds. And at that time, like I was nose deep in muscle and fitness magazines, reading everything I could, protein. And let me tell you what, I was a man on a mission. My father was a big man. He was 6'4", 200, and when he was young and in shape, 265 pounds. He looked like a linebacker, a former linebacker for the NFL. And I mean, and he towered over me, and he had this handshake that was just like paralyzing. If you ever met my dad, you would never forget him if he shook your hand. And I grew up in a family of big men. And I was the runt of the family. As a matter of fact, when I look at my two brothers that I have a common father with, my two brothers are bigger framed men than me. Like the wrists are much bigger and stuff like that. I might be the biggest of the three of us, but like I look at them and they're just husky big men. And I'm like, man, like I was lifting with my brother the other day, my brother Greg, and I was like, dude, he just looks so big. And he's looking at me like, no, you look big. I'm like, trust me, man. Like I can't do this around your wrist, but I can touch my wrist. Yeah. Like, you're just a bigger man. And so, growing up in a family like that, like probably there was a little bit of psychological damage as a young kid, wanting to be like my dad. And I took more of the genes of my mother. And so, I had like, maybe there was some proving of myself and stuff like that. But let me tell you something. I was driven my whole life in sport, and in high school, when I started getting into nutrition, I was a man on a mission. I was going to put on some muscle and become the athlete that I always wanted to become. Not because I was thinking I was going to compete in the UFC one day. I was just driven and I wanted to pursue excellence.
So to be sure where that started, the karate started in youth because of or the exercise started because of your relative size compared to your family members. But were you picked on? Where did the martial art fighting part start? Was it your dad that encouraged you to look into karate, or were you actually picked on around Ohio initially, and that's how you developed the love for it? That by 2002, it was your driving love in your life?
Look, I'm a kid that grew up in neighborhoods, right? And like every other kid, you're going to get picked on.
Yeah.
Like everything is bullying now. Like there's just rites of passage. Like every time I moved to a new school, I was the new kid on the block. And of course, you're going to have to prove yourself. I got into a lot of fights as a kid. And as a kid, like up until junior high, I was a big kid. Like I went from like my 5th grade year playing offensive guard on the football team to like my 6th grade year being a split end, because I probably, vertically grew 6 inches or 8 inches in one year, but then horizontally grew maybe like a pound. So, it was vastly different. And I had my fair share of getting in fights and stuff like that. But as a young child, my dad put me into karate when I was 12, the same style of karate, by the way. And I did that for a couple of years. I really enjoyed it as a young kid, but then we moved. I got involved in sports and all that kind of stuff. And I played a bunch of different sports. I was on the swim team for a year when I was a kid. Like tried pretty much everything to see what I liked and what I didn't like. And so when I got into sports, I kind of got away from that. But then after my senior year of football, like on my football team, I was like the Rudy of the team. If you've not seen the movie Rudy, like shame on any of the listeners who've never seen this movie. But I was that guy, first one on the field, last one off the field. And my senior year playing varsity, I probably got a total of like, for the whole season, maybe like 30 minutes of playing time the whole season. I was like special teams and a couple different things here and there, but I didn't get much playing time. And so and it didn't dawn on me that I wasn't going to get a scholarship to college. Like I don't know if I was too stupid or too blind, I should say, to recognize that or whatever. But I was like, no, work. If you work hard enough, you'll get there.
But you got some grants, didn't you?
Not for playing football.
Not for playing, yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, no. I got the other kind of grants, the ones for being smart. And and so I it didn't dawn on me until I was literally handing in my football equipment. I'm like, wait a minute, this is the end of my athletic career. So just to do something, I was like, well, I'll get involved in karate again, because at least that'll keep me from it'll keep me in something athletic and kill two birds with one stone. If I was ever to get in a fight on the street, it becomes useful. So that was my motivation for starting karate. Now, keep in mind, at the time, there was no such thing as mixed martial arts. The first UFC didn't happen for almost about a year later.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So at that point, is that when you started did you went back into karate, and this was in your undergrad, right? Maybe first year? I guess?
No, this was still my senior year of high school. Okay,
and then you set up your training with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and stuff like that. As you grew to like karate, you realized maybe I can fight professionally or.
Oh no! Like everybody else, I was watching. How many of us in 1993 were watching Hoist take on the ground with these guys? He has Dan Severn on top of him, and you're just standing there and you go like this, like, "Come on, man, just get up." Man, if I was there, I would just stand up. And now, right? And now doing jiu-jitsu, you realize you can be on top of somebody, and it's not that easy to just stand up.
Okay, can I ask you guys about something, both Rich and Mike? I've heard rumors, because I know so little about the UFC. I've heard rumors that in the initial fights in MMA, I think they were not in the UFC, where maybe it was Hoist, but they brought in one Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. I think it was Hoist in the first season, but they didn't have any other grapplers. They didn't get wrestlers on initially. So people said that they had poised it such that to show the excellence of BJJ. Yeah. And then a couple of seasons into it, then the wrestlers started getting their hands around how to avoid the takedowns. And then the wrestlers started striking well and defeating the BJJ guys. Is that sort of how it went?
Yeah, I mean, the first UFC actually was kind of set up as a marketing ploy for
that's right.
BJJ. Yeah,
that's neat.
So all those opponents were hand selected. Still a tough thing to do, I mean, keep in mind, Hoist was fighting there were some big guys in that, stylistically and everything. But I would imagine at that time a little bit of that had to be taking candy from a baby. Imagine me grappling with a white belt right now. Right? It's just ridiculous to think such.
Now, another thing you mentioned your strategy. You used to think rigorously and analytically about your matches and see a person's weaknesses compared to your strengths, which, I've listened to many of your interviews where you talk about your thoughts in between rounds in a fight. I guess you're talking to your coaches and you're trying a certain strategy and you guys debate it on the side. It seems very cerebral to me. I can't imagine a fighter in the middle of a fight thinking to such a strategic degree. I didn't know that they did. So I wanted to ask you, did your competitors, were they as strategic in fights as you were, or was it something unusual about you? And also, are most fighters more strategic or tactical?
Well, I would say a bulk of my competitors were not as strategic as me. Otherwise, they wouldn't have lost. So
it was one of your main advantages.
Yeah. Listen,
fight IQ.
I always say this. Here's a problem. And this just applies to life. Emotion trumps logic. So if you start getting emotional about something, you will not think clearly. This is why a homicide investigator would never investigate the murder of his family. It's why a doctor would never operate on, a critical operation of his daughter dying, because your emotion will trump your logic. And so I'm a big believer that you need to keep a level head in a combat situation like that, because the moment you start getting emotional about something, you're this as it applies to war, when you got bullets flying over your head or something like that, as it applies to the cage, when you got punches coming at your face. So you need to be able to think clearly, because if something suddenly happens to me where, I'm emotional about something, I have rage inside of me or something like that, then I'm not executing my game plan as clearly as possible. And this is two stories on this, being cerebral. So first one, when I was fighting Jason McDonald, that was in Columbus at Nationwide Arena. Jason and I were mixing things up, and this was just after I lost the second time to Anderson. I was a bit gun shy about getting punched in the face, and so I ended up taking him down. We're on the ground, and I remember when we hit the ground, there's a catwalk around the cage. I tell this story; it's funny. this catwalk around the cage. And there's like this little gap between the cage and the catwalk. That's only like an inch, like the catwalk is where the ring girls walk around the outside. But I happened to be positioned in a point in the ring where I could look down and I could see this, like between the slit of the mat on the inside and the catwalk on the outside. And I can see underneath the catwalk and I see an American flag. And then suddenly Jason bumps me and I'm out of position. I can't see down there anymore. And I'm in the middle of this fight and I'm asking myself, why is there an American flag on the ground in this arena? And I thought, when this fight's over, I'm going to go get the American flag and get it off the floor. Like whoever left that on the floor. So then I take, I'm like, I got to make sure. So I start wiggling him back in the middle of the fight.
This guy's having full thoughts in the middle of a fight. I had a feeling you were doing that.
Yeah, in the middle of the fight. And I look and I'm like, oh no, that's a blue electrical box with red cables coming out of it. True story. Now, on the flip side of that, there was in the Vanderlei fight, Vanderlei drops me in the second round. Great fight. If anybody ever asked me like which of my fights I would show somebody to kind of showcase who I was as an athlete, it would be that fight, because
the first Vanderlei fight, you fought him twice, didn't you?
Second one. I mean, they're both good fights, but the second one, because he about beats me within an inch of my life in the second round. And I survived that round, and I'm on autopilot for rounds 3 and 4. And I jokingly tell people, but kind of somewhat seriously, I'm like, man, I look at my performance in rounds 3 and 4 and I'm like, wow, I was completely on autopilot, had no clue where I was, and just executing the game plan. And this is the importance of like your training, because you're going to default to whatever becomes second nature. And then between the 4th and the 5th round, I come down, I sit down on the bench. Okay, guys, I'm back. Because all the instructions that they gave me is like, the best way I can describe it when you've been concussed like that in a fight is like, if you've ever watched one of the old Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoons, and all the adults in those cartoons, when they talk, it was like, because they're basically making fun of like kids don't ever understand what adults are saying anyway. But that's kind of like what I'm hearing. And then it's like, you gotta get your move and keep your hand up. And I'm like, okay, guys, I'm back. And they knew exactly what I was talking about. And so for 2 full rounds, I was on complete autopilot. And I look at myself and I watched those rounds, and I watched the game plan that we'd set. Our game plan in that match was like single and double punches, no more than 3 punch combinations. Do not get caught on the inside with Vanderlei. He's like a little tornado, Tasmanian devil. Jab, 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 move, use your footwork. And you watch me in the 3rd round come back out, and I established that jab right away. Now, this is not me bragging about my performance. This is me bragging about the fact that you revert to what you've been trained to do. And so this is why repetition is very important in life, not just in the physical training that you do, but in life. So that when caution gets thrown to the wind, when you have a concussion, when emotion wants to take over, it's like, no, your body reverts to that thing that it knows that it should do. My body knows that I shouldn't drink if I want to accomplish my goals. So I never get emotional about things. I never sit and say like, man, I just need a beer to take the sting off of this thing because life sucks right now.
But okay, that's on that topic, the last thing you mentioned. So what about this thing of you have goals, right? You're working towards your goals. You're not drinking the beer because of your goals. Not that you need the beer, because you don't drink beer generally. So it's not something that you're disciplined about anyway. But do you ever get the feeling that like in life, sometimes we're always moving toward a goal and not living somewhat in the present? And how do you balance between, because I wanted to ask you questions about your fighting, but you mentioned something very interesting there. Repeatedly, you have this focus of moving somewhere. Yeah. Do you ever find that it stops you from enjoying the moment or living in the moment?
Absolutely. And it's amazing how you can kind of compartmentalize these things. So living in the moment, I've been very guilty of this. As a matter of fact, I've said this before, if you've heard any of my interviews, the night that I won my title was a very lonely night. I was fighting at Trump Plaza up in Atlantic City. And after we won, this was at a time where you could like leave the arena and just walk back to your hotel room and not completely get accosted by fans, like I had. But I remember I had my belt, and you go from this arena of 12,000, 15,000, 20,000, how many ever fans there are there, screaming fans, to suddenly walking into my hotel room. Now, at the time, my wife was with me, like maybe 2 of my training partners and one of my coaches, or, about 4 people in the room. I set the belt down on the bed and I looked at it, and I just stood there and I was like, man, I don't feel like a champion because nothing had changed. Because I was the same person I was 4 hours prior, but now suddenly I just had this shiny new toy, and it doesn't really make a difference. And so what I had realized at that point in my career is I was so focused on this goal. Like I will achieve this goal. And I had this mentality of like, you don't see me celebrate very often after I win a match. Like you see me after the Ken Shamrock fight, I was excited for that one, but rarely did I like really get fired up, celebrated, because growing up as a kid, like I really looked up to Barry Sanders, who was a running back for the Detroit Lions, as one of my athlete heroes. And one of the things that Barry was known for, not purposely, but he never spiked the football or never celebrated when he entered the end zone. He maybe did a few times in his entire career, but was it rare? And he crossed the end zone like he was meant to be there. It was almost like as if Barry knew, like, you're giving me the ball and I'm gonna end up in the end zone anyway, so why spike this ball? It was just inevitable. And I kind of had this mentality, and I had this, like, I projected myself onto this goal that was down the road of winning the title. And when I finally got there, it was like the most deflating feeling that I could possibly imagine, because nothing had changed. I just had this belt, and I was so focused on the goal that I forgot to enjoy the journey. It was at that point in my life where I really started taking note of these things, because in my training, the funny thing is you can't focus on just the goal. And this is how you can compartmentalize these things in your life, and how you need to be careful, because you can be so good at it in one aspect, but not in another, is that you can't just focus on the goal. Like, the goal is winning the fight. But in order to win the fight, I have to focus on the very first rep of the very first drill of the very first day of camp. And then when I do that, I have to focus on the second rep of the first drill of the first exercise of the first day of camp. And then I focus on the third rep, and so on. Because if I'm thinking win the fight, I'm not paying attention to the details that are going to win me the fight. So I have to be in that moment. I have to be present. And what's amazing to me is that in my life, I was very good at this professionally, but on a personal level, I wasn't. And so it's crazy how, and going back to the statement I made, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so this was a weak link in my life at that time. Like, I didn't have that full ecosystem, and it's taken me a lot of time towards the back end of my career. I started really appreciating that. When I fought Vanderlei the first time in Cologne, it was a 15-minute war. And I came back from the arena, and I was beat up. I'd been hit, my head hurt, whatever. And I pulled up to the hotel, and there was probably, 2,000 fans in the parking lot, and just there congregating. And we pulled up, and I looked at the driver. I said, "Man, is there a back entrance or something?" Like, and my boxing coach looked at me, he goes, "Hey, Rich," he's like, "Listen, man, how many more of these you got?" He's like, "You got to appreciate these moments." I'm like, "Yeah, you're right." So I get out, and this fanfare, I was hungry. Like, I wanted to eat. And I was meeting my friends for dinner, and because I typically would buy my team and friends dinner after the fights. Like, and we had a separate room that they sequestered for us where they were serving us dinner. And I stood out there, and I probably went through. I call it a picture 2-step policy. It's like a dance. Take a picture, take 2 steps. Take a picture, take 2 steps, so that you're at least making progress, right? But I was probably outside for another hour and a half signing all these autographs for these fans. Now, oddly enough, my boxing coach, who told me to enjoy this moment, the moment I got out of the car, completely disappeared. I was like, he was eating. So yeah, but no, you really did learn to enjoy those moments.
You mentioned celebrating after the Ken Shamrock fight. I actually wanted to ask you about that, because I wonder if when you were growing up, at least when you were regionally fighting, if Ken was somebody you were looking up toward. At the time, he was a worldwide superstar. Yeah. And he was maybe the biggest name, I think, in MMA so far in the last few years. You defeated him very conclusively. Yeah. You were the first person to ever knock him out. So it was I wonder what the feeling was like then. You said you celebrated that night.
Well, okay, so you just told me that I was the first person to ever knock him out.
I think you.
I didn't know that.
First.
I believe you. So I didn't know that. I'll say this. Yeah, growing up, like watching Ken and watching these initial guys, like, I had respect for everybody, but Ken was the first guy who really encompassed like a lot of the mixed martial art mentality, right? He's a shoot fighter, had decent stand up, and he looked the part. Like, he looked like a Roman gladiator. And so when, the whole time I was watching, like, I was always rooting for Ken. And then, Ken did some fights in Japan, transitioned into professional wrestling, came back into mixed martial arts. So at the time when I was teaching, a lot of my students knew who Ken was. Like, he was the household name. And they would ask me, like, they would say, Mr. Franklin, you think that you could beat Ken Shamrock? And I was like, yeah. Right. And then, so when I quit teaching in 2002, I worked in an at-risk program, teaching 2 days a week in an off-campus facility to kids that were like, about to be expelled from school, had gotten into fights, girls that had gotten pregnant and having difficulty possibly graduating. And I remember I taught at that program up until about 10 days before my title fight. 2 nights a week. But I remember like talking about that, and I was teaching in this program, and then they would always ask me about Ken Shamrock. Everybody did. And I was always like, well, that would be easy. And then suddenly the fight gets signed with Ken, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is Ken Shamrock, first of all. And I've been talking all this trash to my students thinking that this would never happen. And now I got to put my money where my mouth is. So when I stood face to face with Ken in the cage, which was the longest face off I've ever had, because it's the first time that the UFC did an event on live television on Spike TV, and we had to cut the commercial break and all that kind of stuff. Like, we had what was the equivalent of about a 10-minute stare down with the commercial break included. And I just, like, the whole time I was just like thinking, like, yeah, I've been running my mouth. He doesn't even know, but I've been running my mouth to my students, and now all my students are back home watching this. So here's that moment. So yeah, I was pretty excited with somebody like Ken, because like I said, at the beginning of this entire thing, he was one of the guys that I really enjoyed watching.
Now, can I ask you something that I don't understand? So middleweights, you started as a middleweight, right? You were never lower than a middleweight.
No, I started off as like okay. So keep in mind, at the time, the weight classes were different when I first started fighting. Oh, right. They didn't have all the weight classes that they had. Like eventually they added like the light, welter, middle, light, heavy, and heavyweight classes. They had those 5 weight classes. But prior to that, I think as I was training and coming up, there were kind of like only 3, like a heavyweight, light heavyweight, and then I don't know what the other one was. I can't remember. But yeah, so I always felt like in this middle ground, and probably the heaviest I ever weighed for a fight was somewhere around 220. Okay. But I was carrying too much weight. Like, I was like, yeah, it just wasn't good fighting for me. But no, initially I started fighting at 205 because I fought my first fight with Evan Tanner was at 205. Because my first fight with Edwin, my second fight with Edwin DeWeese was at 205. And then the UFC started the middleweight class. And then, because we were all on this cusp of like not the right weight class. And then I came in and I fought Jorge Rivera at 185. Then when I fought Ken, I went back up to 205.
That was later when you went back to the light heavyweights, right?
Well, no, I mean, I just fought Ken in that fight. They just wanted me to fight Ken.
Okay, yeah, that was
Ken wanted to fight at 205. But oddly enough, Ken weighed in less than me. Like, I weighed 205 on the dot, and he weighed 203. And I was a little nervous about that. Like, why did you request 205 if you can actually cut weight further than me? And so I was like, what did he do different with it? Like, I remember thinking about that at the weigh-ins. Like, what's he got up his sleeve here?
You're a very thoughtful guy.
Oh, absolutely, man. Details. The devil's in the details, bro. You got to pay attention to everything.
I would assume people would be trying to be zen in that moment just before the fight and try not to let the distractions. But you're thinking about things during the fight while being concussed and stuff, still thinking about stuff.
Well, I always say don't fight the fight before the fight, right? So when I was, what fight was this? David Loiseau? I think it was a David Loiseau fight. Was that one at Mandalay? No, that was at MGM.
I don't know.
I don't remember which fight it was. I can't remember. I was in Vegas though, but it was fight day, and I said to my team, like, guys, I need to keep my mind off the fight. Like, let's. So we went to the movie and watched Matrix, the second Matrix movie. And I remember like that movie was longer than I had anticipated, and the movie lets out, and I get out of the and I'm like, guys, man, I'm gonna be late. Like, we gotta be at the arena, and as I was walking out, this. There was another guy coming in the movie, and he goes, Rich Franklin? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, wait, don't you have a fight?
Yeah, wait.
I'm like, yeah, I'm running late. I got to go.
Don't you get like adrenaline signaling where you can't be that relaxed and just head to a movie? Or are you naturally like a even keel, or do you practice it? Do you control your adrenaline?
Well, I think so. It's interesting. So I've been thinking about this. Like, I interviewed Wim Hof on my podcast.
Yeah, very interesting guy.
Wim Hof, talking to him, he has the ability to actually activate and turn off his adrenal glands, right? Like, he can, and these are measurable measurable things. Like he's had this stuff actually measured in his blood work where, he could turn these things on and off. So I believe that this is a trainable thing. So, in contemplating this, like I don't have Wim Hof's ability, or maybe I do, and I just don't know about it. But I'll say this about that kind of stuff. Obviously, when you live the life like this kind of lifestyle and you do the things that I do for a living, my ability to handle adrenaline is a lot different than somebody who works that risk adverse job like you brought up before, right? Because, take a person who's never been punched in the face before. When suddenly somebody stands up and puts their fist up, they're like, their adrenaline skyrockets. That fight or flight like kicks in. If I'm in a bar and somebody puts up their fist like they're going to punch me in the face, I'm like this, like, really, dude, I actually got to put this drink down. Like there's no response, right? Because I've been there before, but I think another is because I'm used to this situation where I can somewhat, maybe, I don't know, involuntarily regulate this.
Can I ask you a question about that? I'm very curious. So when soldiers go to war abroad, they initially have high adrenaline signaling because it's fight or flight. They got to watch, that saves their lives. But then sometimes soldiers will have a horrific experience where their comrades will die in a bombing or something. They see it up close, and then this affects their psyche. Afterwards, they develop something called PTSD, which tends to be when you have high adrenaline signaling that is uncontrolled, and you see people shake sometimes. They get nervous because they anticipate this crazy, horrific experience they had. Do fighters, maybe not even your own experience, but have you ever seen fighters lose that cool? Where, like you said, at the bar, you know how to fight. You're always in those situations. You're comfortable with it. But say one day you got in a fight that really hurt you. Do you ever then lose that cool and that confidence, and maybe your adrenaline could upregulate really fast if you get in those situations? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. So going back to the soldier example, just the flip side of that, this happens on both sides. I have friends who've served in the Middle East, like Somalia, for example. I have a buddy of mine that tells me a story about, he said, he talked to me about the first time that they ever had, that they were in Mogadishu. And he was like, when the first time that we had mortars going off, he's like, I was about to piss myself. He said, and it's amazing how quickly you become desensitized to this stuff. He's like, bullets flying by your head. He's like, and you're just standing up like you're like G.I. Joe, like it's no big deal type of thing. Because the adrenaline it becomes an everyday experience. Now, as that applies to, like life, and you're talking about fighting and adrenaline and PTSD and all that kind of stuff, like getting into a fight. This is one of the reasons why staying very mentally even keeled, being able to not allow emotion to trump logic is important. Because, for example, if I was to get into a fight in a bar, I would probably almost be like irritated by the fact that I was going to get into that fight. But like if somebody broke into my house, for example, that's my motive for combat at that point in time is much different. And I think that if somebody broke into my house, that's a switch that it would not turn off as quickly as it would be like with some drunken guy at a bar.
What I mean to say is, so for example, imagine somebody goes off to Afghanistan, has a really horrible tour, a lot of people died, and they get this kind of PTSD kind of thing.
Yeah.
I feel like there's some fighters, I've talked to Mike about it before, that they fight for a period of years, do excellent. They have their full bravery in the ring. They're not afraid to take risky choices and do certain things like that. And then they'll have a fight which goes badly for them. And then after that, you'll notice they're reluctant to to engage fully. Like I imagine Tyron Woodley might be a good example of this.
Well,
maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, well, we had this happen actually in my camp. Dustin Hazlett was a longtime training partner of mine. And this didn't happen in the ring, but Dustin, I was just watching his fight the other day. I happened to catch this with Josh Berkman. And man, this kid, Dustin was like, oh my gosh, his jiu-jitsu. He was amazing. And there was a time when I was grappling with Justin and I had him push against the fence and I had him about to suplex him. I had his hand trapped between his legs, like in a Greco hold. And he somehow jumps up and triangles me out of this position in training. Dustin was a killer, but what happened was we were training one day in the gym. I actually wasn't there, and he hit one of my training partners with a knee to the stomach, and my training partner kind of doubled over. And of course, us being guys initially were like, "Yeah, come on, get up, quit being a sissy, like come on." And come to find out, like my buddy Chris, he ended up having to get like 2 inches of his colon removed or something like that.
Oh wow!
Dustin felt responsible for this,
wow.
And suddenly was like, kind of like lost his killer instinct. And I think he maybe fought 2 more times after that or whatever. But when he came out, we're looking at him like, dude, what's going on, man? Like, you don't have that edge. And he was just like, I don't want to hurt anybody. And so on the flip side, like there's that aspect of it. So this, I don't know, how. I think that each person is built differently, much like, I mean, look, now we're speculating on the brain and how the brain works, right? People that have PTSD, my oldest brother was a Marine sniper. He doesn't talk about it. Like, and he's probably seen more things than 10 men should see in a lifetime. Right. And so the circuitry there has obviously been affected. Some people, they get a single concussion and they can never fight again. Some people, they get concussions. Like I've to date probably counted about 8 concussions in competition. I wouldn't even know if I'm sure you have many concussions every time.
You've had many more than you know.
Yeah, I mean, getting punched in the head, like, this is not, even doing this is not good for me.
No, that kills neurons, by the way, even just that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, just doing that does.
Yes, yes.
Perfect example is Matt Hughes, who got hit by the train. Matt got hit by that train in his car. And as I understand it, there was no head trauma. He did not actually smack his head against the glass or the frame of the car or anything like that. It's just that when he got hit, it rattled him so much that it affected his brain. Wow. So it's like when you start thinking about how the brain works, it's like, I would imagine that, for example, like some people that go to war can handle seeing dozens of people killed, whether enemy or friendly forces, and other people, they see one and it's game over for them. And similarly with concussions.
Rich, we're talking, go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Yeah. So after we had this conversation also, Leo and I, with Chris Lieben, and as a result of the conversation, I had a few buddies in the fight game that reached out to me that wanted to share their story. I don't want to mention their names because it was private conversations, but we came up with, they all went through similar points, and some very famous individuals, by the way, and they're out of the game right now. And they all talked about a certain moment in either training or in a fight when they took a beating, if you will. They got hit with a shot that they never got hit with before. They couldn't take a shot that they normally used to walk through. And I came up with the term, but I realized we always think about, well, it's fight or flight, fight or flight, fight or flight. That's not true. It's fight or flight or fetal, where they didn't run out of the cage. They didn't run away. They didn't fight even harder. They said their body just shuts down. They stand there, they see it, they know it's happening. They know that they should punch or kick but they just don't. And each of them, I spoke with 5 different guys, 4 of them all said the same thing. My body just wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. The troops would not go into battle as much as they wanted them to. And I found it, really interesting, sad in a way, because it was just touching conversations. But I had witnessed it, Lieben had spoken about it. And then, just through the years, athletes who go through this, you see them in the gym, they're a monster, something happens. And maybe it's even in their personal life, something happens. And then overnight, they're not the same athlete ever again. And that it's a really sad thing, but it's something to be aware of. Now, crossing over that border and getting into the war fighters, as the military men and women call themselves. There's, professional fighters, and then there's the war fighters being considerably more serious. But it's that something happens. And whatever that is, hey, we could have a conversation and get some neuroscientists on to have that deeper, level of conversation. But something happens, and I just say, hey, that there's a switch. And Rich said, Rich handled it differently, and he continued to fight on and move forward as a result of trauma and, all the concussions and things like that. Probably more trauma than other athletes have had, cumulatively speaking, where they shut down and they went, and I say fetal to be no disrespect at all, but just to show the vision of these awesome, amazing physical specimens that could literally beat up the entire world population, all but maybe 2 or 3 other humans. And they can't even throw a punch. They can barely protect themselves. And what was interesting is they looked for a way out. They gave the neck in a position, man, Rich, you're shaking your head. They gave the arm. They covered up when Herb Dean is like, you got to move. Nothing's landing hard. But they just want to get the hell out of there. Even when one of these they were winning the fight. They just didn't have to, they just had to move a little bit and they would have won the fight. It's just like, I was done. I knew I was done. I wanted to get out.
As we're sitting here talking about this, what comes to mind is like your genetics versus your epigenetics, right? So genetically, like to kind of put this in relation, like my father died of a heart attack at the age of 56. My grandfather had his first heart attack like at 62 or 63 and then ended up dying of a heart attack at 69. So genetically, I probably have the precursors for heart attack. Now, I live the kind of lifestyle where, like, if I end up dying of a heart attack, I will be shocked because I do everything I can possibly do to live as healthy as I possibly can. Like, I try to get the right amount of sleeps. I maintain my stress, nutrition's on point, training, all that kind of, like, every possible aspect of spiritually. I try to keep myself centered and focused and aligned. And so what I've done with my epigenetic environment is try to keep from switching that thing on. There are certain people in this world that if they take one drink, they become an alcoholic because they have that gene for it or whatever. That's in their genetics. So maybe I have that gene. Maybe I'm an alcoholic and I don't even know it because I've never taken a sip of alcohol. Like maybe if I were to take that sip, I would suddenly turn that marker on. And so as it applies to the brain, I would imagine that this is a genetic versus epigenetic kind of thing. There are probably some people that are just more predispositioned. And we all are. I mean, I would imagine that everybody has a breaking point, right? Like how much stuff do I have to go through in the ring, or how many things do I have to see in life if I'm in war? Like how many people do I have to kill or see killed or whatever before I eventually snap? And so these epigenetic factors can affect that. But I imagine just like some of us have in certain aspects of life, breaking points or those flips, those switches get flipped on sooner than others.
So Mike, you mentioned indecisiveness as being the main feeling that they consciously experienced. Were they also mentioning like anxiety or fear of failure or of being hurt, or was it just indecisiveness?
No, great question, Leo. And we actually did delve deeper. And I was after the second call, I became more specific because I keep notes, right? And I took notes and I continued with the notes and we continued on. And of each of them, there was no fear. There was no anxiety. It was apathy. They became numb. Oh, they didn't feel anything.
Did they have depersonalization, which means they feel like they're looking at their life from an outside perspective, apathetically?
It wasn't their body. They felt like they weren't in their body. They weren't in control anymore. Okay. And they just wanted it to be over. They just wanted to be out of there. This
is a really interesting subject, actually. Rich, I may have not mentioned this to you, but one of my biggest research interests is neuroscience, because I've suffered with a lot of psychological issues before, like alcoholism and stuff like that. So I try to deal with it. But I wanted to mention about the indecisiveness has certain neurochemical causes sometimes in people. So you can cause indecisiveness. I don't know exactly which neurotransmitters may be involved. For example, it may be high adrenaline signaling with low serotonin and GABA signaling. So you have a lot of energy, but less calmness to settle on a decision. But there are some genetics for that. The other thing I want to mention also is, there is like a neurochemical perspective in which it could cause indecisiveness. The thought may be that, just like what Rich was saying, I think you may have a single event that changes the way, because the way I describe it to people often is like, think of all your cells in your body as having, I was playing poker. They have a set of cards and they throw down a card every round. And think of those as your genes. So the epigenetics are what you decide to express of your genes, but you have a wide array of genes. There can be individual moments in people's lives that change them epigenetically. So I assume that can cause like a downregulation of GABA systems or serotonin systems or something like that in the brain as well. Also, Rich, you talked about a really interesting subject that both of your father and grandfather died of heart disease early. I don't know if you know this, but I have a genetic analysis service I do for people. I don't really do it anymore. Me and another channel called More Plates, More Dates, we're releasing a algorithm that will be on separate sections of people's genome. So we're going to have one for cardiovascular health. I already have it. I just haven't made the algorithm fully. If you're ever interested, you want to do a 23andMe or Ancestry.com, I can actually pull out your raw data, and my analysis is like 6 pages long. It's really comprehensive. And I can tell you about the genes that potentially may have made your father and grandfather die earlier. And keep in mind, every generation there's meiosis. So meaning you only get, for every single nucleotide polymorphism, you get 2 amino acids, one from your dad, one from your mom. So at every gene that your dad had, he's only giving you 1 allele. So unless your mom matches that allele, you're never going to be in the worst position, which is the homozygous, where they're both the same. So if you're interested, by the way, I could check it out because there are some main ones like ApoE4, CTEP, APOC3, very well-known genes that have a tremendous impact on your cardiovascular health, you know?
Yeah, this is something we can definitely discuss. I'll say this though. If you gave me a genetic report that was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if there's anything in my lifestyle that I could actually change.
Yes, there is. Oh, no, I mean, maybe you're living the best life you can.
Yeah,
what
exactly.
I meant to say is there's interesting specific research about the individual polymorphisms and how they may alternate. Like, for example, ApoE4 really makes it really important for people in their 50s and 60s to put a lot of effort into sleep because they seem to have very bad REM sleep compared to other people. And that's a cardiovascular determinant. But yeah, I'm sure you're probably living the best life you can is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I try to. I would say right now, if there was one thing that's off, it would be my sleep because working for one, they're based out of Singapore. So I'm still working on the Asia time zone. So oftentimes I'm up way later than I need to be. But other than that, that's something that I can't help. And this is just a stage in life that I'm going through for now, but it'll eventually fix itself. But yeah, I would be interested in some reading on this as well, man. Like this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I wanted to mention, by the way, about Wim Hof. I don't know if you know this, but Wim Hof, sure, he has this breathing method to raise noradrenaline, which is the kind of adrenaline in your nervous system, and he can slow it down with his breathing too. But this is the thing, so people say like his breathing is what's causing him to resist the cold and all that. The thing is, they've analyzed his body. He has a very unusual amount of brown fat. You know what brown fat is, right? The thermogenically active. So we have like a white adipose tissue, and then we have like what they call beige fat. It's like turning into brown fat, and then we have something called brown fat. I've had a surgery before where I saw a bit of my fat, and it was literally dark brown. It was scary. At the time, I thought I had some kind of disease. Later, I researched. It turns out if you are a person who's hung out in the cold a lot, or if you have high adrenaline levels naturally, adrenaline really governs this, your fat can turn brown by increasing the amount of mitochondria in the fat. The more mitochondria, the darker the fat looks. Dark fat is thermogenically active. It heats up your body. Funny thing about Wim Hof, he has a lot of brown fat, but so does his twin brother. Yeah. So it may be a genetic thing that he can withstand the cold so much. His twin brother, who does none of this stuff, happens to have the same amount of brown fat. Almost the same amount. Yeah,
I'll say this. We don't want to get sidetracked too much.
Yeah, but it's an interesting subject.
Yeah, talking to Wim, because they had there was that study that was done where they had injected him with the cytotoxin, and he said, "No, I can beat this thing." Because I think it was E. coli that they put in him or whatever. And so then they said, "Well, that's because you're special." And he said, "Well, no, I can replicate this." And they did it with 12 different people that were doing his program. Yeah. So you're right.
No, there's a lot of evidence for his program. I just meant his ability to withstand the cold is a little bit genenically influenced.
Well,
there's a lot of evidence for it.
His ability to withstand the cold is a lot better than my ability to withstand.
Yeah.
Every time I had to do an ice bath, dude, and I think my wrestling coach would just do this just to I think everything in my career was just a test of mental fortitude. All the stuff that Mike put me through, all those tread sessions that Matt Hume put me through, all the ice baths that Ryan put me through, like all these things were just like you get diminishing returns on an ice bath, like that's much longer than say like 5 minutes max. And we would sit in these things for 15 minutes. And I think it was just like, can you withstand it? Can you sit there for 15 minutes? Because, at the end of the day, like I had this like mental fortitude. We talk about this like breaking point in people. And I'll see this before where somebody has their back taken and then suddenly like they lift their head up to go ahead and, give away the neck so that they can get out of that situation. And the only time I've ever been in that situation in my life in a fight where I was like, I'm pretty much lost here or whatever was when I was fighting Travis Lutter. And I talked about that in my TED talk as well. But in the Lutter fight, like he had me mounted, and it was pretty much like in our camp, like when we did the little matrix thing that I talked about earlier, it was like, look, don't get mounted. If you get mounted, this fight's over. There was no solution for that. And so when I was there was this moment of me mentally breaking on the ground where I thought like, man, I've lost. And then I was like, no, I got one last ditch effort here I can do. I'm gonna give him the arm and I'm gonna try to do this escape. And so I feed him my arm and then come out with that hitchhiker escape and it was just like, I can't allow myself to give up. And so I don't know, for me talking about that stuff, like where my breaking point would be for me to just, as Mike put it, fetal fold.
Rich Habib, I know we call him Habib. By the way, Mike, I finally found out what Habib's name is in Arabic. So Habib Nurmagomedov in Arabic, his name is Habib, which means beloved. It's actually an Arabic word. So I've always been confused because it had a K in the beginning. So I was always like, but in Arabic. So anyway, his name is Habib, apparently. And that's how this pronounced it. So I was listening to an interview with Habib and Mike Tyson recently, which was, by the way, phenomenal. And Habib was talking about a fight he had, I think with, it doesn't matter who it is, but I think it's with Conor McGregor, in which he said he came to fight and he was really excited about the fight. And he was really dismayed that Conor tapped out in front of his fans. He said, all these people came from Ireland to watch you. I didn't have a leg lock or an arm lock on you or something like that. It was your neck. You could have at least went to sleep. You shouldn't have tapped. What do you think of that, Rich? This idea of going to sleep instead of tapping?
I mean, then it's like, well, if you have the arm, why not just let the arm snap, right? When you're caught, you're caught. It's kind of like...
But the arm you can't recover from, I thought, right? So the neck, is the neck like, it's no problem? Or
what does it matter? What does it matter? Like, let's say you and I are grappling, all right? And let's just say that I'm a better grappler than you. And then you catch me in a submission.
Yeah.
And because I'm a black belt and my grappling partner is not a black belt, I'm going to get... let my pride get in the way and I decide not to tap. And you see this all the time. And maybe I get hurt. Maybe I actually escape. Oftentimes when I'm grappling with somebody, like if I'm grappling with somebody and I get caught into something, like I'll tap and just because in my mind, I'm like, I shouldn't have been in this position to begin with. Right.
Mm.
Like it's not the tap where the failure came. It's the fact that I let my opponent get me there. Now, being in that situation and when the stakes are on the line is a much different story. But when the outcome is inevitable, right? Like he's not escaping. Now, me going to sleep, me choosing not to tap and going to sleep instead might be the belief that if I don't tap, I got another second or two, maybe something can happen.
Is there an element of honor there? Because if you go to sleep, you don't really injure yourself, I think, that much, right? If you break your arm, that's ridiculous for honor. I mean, you're just, But I've also heard the Gracies used to not tap initially in Brazil when they used to take all their, like they wouldn't tap against that Japanese guy who beat Hickson Gracie, I think. Have you ever heard of that, Mike?
Is it Sakuraba? Is that who?
Yes, yeah.
Henzo. Yeah. When Henzo
the guy who invented,
he let his arm snap.
Exactly.
I'm live to fight another day, man. When you've lost, you've lost, and that's
now, Richard. At the start of your career, you had you had no losses, I think, until Lyoto as a professional.
Yeah.
What did that first loss? And I know you're a very rational person. I've come to understand how you think about decisions. But that first loss, did it put any kind of did it slow down your progress at all? Did it make any self-doubt at all, or did you just analyze your mistakes? And what was the mistake? Because I saw when I watched the full match just to try to understand what happened, I don't know what I'm watching obviously, but I thought it just seemed like he was overly powerful. Like when he got on top of you grappling, he was physically strong, so it was difficult to get out of. And then the leg kick at the end, maybe that was hit you in the head and I think hurt you, right?
But the mistake was probably overestimating myself and arrogance or something like that. I didn't do the research on Lyoto that I needed to. I accepted that fight. There was a lot of other things. I mean, I flew to Japan. It was like all these things that affected my performance. I wasn't like we were.
Why was it in Japan, by the way? Because isn't he Brazilian Japanese?
Yeah, but he was. We fought in Inoki Bombaye, and he was Antonio Inoki's protege. Oh, so the fight was in Japan on a New Year's Eve show, which is a big night of events in Japan. And look, they did everything they could to possibly mess with me. Like I didn't have heat in my locker room. It was cold in Osaka. And
that is a low promoter move right there, right?
There's a lot of stuff, man.
I bet.
They didn't come in, I didn't have the bout order. They didn't tell me what time I'd probably be up. I didn't have a proper warm up. And these are not excuses because really the reason why I lost that match is because I didn't know who Lyoto was at the time. I think he only had maybe 3 or 4 fights. Mm-hmm. And I overestimated my ability and underestimated him as an opponent. And that's why I lost that match. And so I wasn't prepared when I came in. He was tighter on his movements. Like we both stepped in for a left cross. He's a southpaw at the same time, and his was just quicker to deliver than mine was. And he caught me with that initial left cross, which was the beginning of the end. And so, yeah, I was bested on that night. And so you, much like my TED talk, like you can go back and you can look at these losses, and you need to have the ability to what I call it in that TED talk was situational amnesia. You have to be able to take and extract from a loss or from any sort of traumatic event in your life and extract the useful information. Utilize that useful information, analyze that useful information, use that information to help you move forward. And you need to discard the rest of that and just have situational amnesia where you don't forget it, where you don't remember it. Otherwise, you will hold on to that stuff like emotional baggage that just weighs you down. And I've been able to do that in every single loss that I've had. Like, even after I lost to Anderson, for example, I told the story of Jason. When I fought Jason, when I stepped into the ring that time, even the first time that I sparred, like the first time I came back in the gym and sparred, I had my nose broken. And I remember the first time I got jabbed in the face, I was over slipping and moving way far out of the way and doing all these things just because, it takes a second maybe to get back on the horse again. But me, I'm determined. I'm like, no, I'm gonna get back on. Even though this horse threw me off, I'm gonna get back on this horse. And so eventually, things tighten up, and I'm doing what I need to do. And because I know that things are eventually gonna move the direction that they need to move. So I use that situational amnesia, and I discard anything that's not useful to me.
Oh yeah, let's make a note about that. So for people who haven't seen your TED Talk, search TED Talk, Rich Franklin, watch it. For everyone listening, it is beautiful. Honestly, it almost brought me to tears. To be honest with you, it was very beautiful, very inspirational, and it's very short. And really, I agree very much with the selective amnesia approach to life. I'm someone who suffered with holding, those kind of ruminating over previous thoughts before. Unfortunately, some people can't get around that sometimes without, psychiatric medications or something like. For example, SSRIs potently inhibit the rumination over past ideas and past faults. So sometimes it's difficult to do consciously, but it's such a brilliant approach.
Well, and I'll say this along those lines too. It was amazing in my life how I was able to apply this concept to something. Remember when I talked about compartmentalization before? Professionally, I was able to apply this very well. In my personal life, I was not, because what prompted that TED Talk for me actually was the death of my father. Because when my dad passed away, emotionally, I didn't know how to deal with that. I had never had anybody close to me like that. My grandfather passed away, but I wasn't super close to my grandfather growing up. He was just that kind of grandfather that I can only remember, if me and my brother were wrestling in the living room, he'd come in and give us that look like, what are you doing? And so when my father passed away, I didn't have the tools that I needed to deal with that. And that affected everything. It affected me personally, it affected me professionally, performances, all that kind of stuff. And so it was I needed to be able to take these tools, these skills that I have in my professional life, and learn how to apply them to my personal life. And that's not just with that kind of stuff, but anything organizational features and all these kinds of things. And so it was that was the catalyst for me learning how to decompartmentalize things a lot better in my life.
Were you and your father on good terms after he started coming to your bouts and accepted your new career and everything?
Yeah. We never talked about that story. So when the day I went to my dad, keep in mind, man, it's 2002 was when I quit teaching full time. And I come to my dad. Now, education was everything to my father. We graduated in the same year, like I previously mentioned. And so when I'm suddenly talking to him in 2002, and I'm like, Dad, I'm going to quit my job teaching, and I'm going to pursue this career in fighting, which if you look at the industry at the time, the thought of making a living fighting mixed martial arts or the UFC or whatever was just the most absurd thing you could possibly think of, right?
Just for the audience to know, this was a time where the UFC was not even accepted in all states. They couldn't even. Yeah, it
was still banned in a lot of this. They hadn't gained sanctioning in a lot of the states. And so my dad was looking at me like, what? You're going to throw away your education, which was the pride and joy, because it was this is my smart son. It's this one right here. He's the smart guy. And so I'm just going to throw this away. My dad has spent his entire late adulthood going back and earning a degree in nursing. It took him 10 years to earn that degree because he was working full time and all that kind of stuff. And so for me to just basically piss all over my education and be like, yeah, that was fun while I did it, but I'm moving on to this other thing now. My dad, I think my dad just wanted to punch me. And he probably would have if it was something other than fighting. He probably did the calculation maybe this is not a good idea. a little too big to be hitting now.
I wish he was a chess player. Yeah.
Yeah. But no. So he, I tell the story all the time. People ask me when people ask me what's your favorite fight? And I don't give a favorite fight. My favorite moment of my career was when I got chills. I don't know if you can see it, but I got chills. My dad came to one of my title defenses. I was in, I think it was maybe the Loazo fight in Las Vegas. And I was sitting there with him I met him over at the Luxor, and he was sitting there, he was eating. I was chewing on some ice chips. and because I was making weight. And my dad looked at me, he said, man, he's like, hey, I'm really proud of you for what you've done in life. He's like, you had a lot of naysayers, myself included, that was pushing you to just, go the route that everybody else goes in life. And you said, no, this is what I'm going to do. And you believed in yourself when other people didn't. And to see what you've accomplished is truly amazing. And my dad was really, really proud of me. I'm going to back off this story a little bit before I start getting all choked up and whatnot. My dad was very proud of me. And so, and I felt that I was his oldest son, and that was a big deal to me. That meant a lot to me.
Oh, you were the oldest son. I thought your full brother might've been older than you. Is his name Gary?
No, my younger brother's Greg, but Greg. No, I have, my mom was married before my dad. So I have brother, sister, half siblings. Then me and my brother Greg are full siblings. And then my dad got remarried and had sister, brother. So
you're the eldest of your dad's kids.
Yeah, I was his oldest son, and I take on a lot of the oldest sibling. If you've done any birth order research,
I'm like that too. I'm eldest. Also.
Yeah. So I have the
pressures, the responsibilities.
Yeah, my older siblings all moved out of the house when I was at a young age, and plus, when the gender difference, like there's a 10-year gap between me and my older brother anyway. So I'm definitely an oldest sibling by birth order and personality characteristics.
Did he pass from a sudden heart attack? Was it? Sudden heart attack. Okay.
Yeah, sudden heart attack. My dad was overweight and stuff. I mean, obviously a man who is 6'4", 265 when he's young, who doesn't take care of himself, like by the time my dad
probably got to 300.
Oh, more than that, 340 probably. And he was so big, like he was such a husky man that he hit it well. Like you wouldn't have realized like how overweight my dad was. He was just a big dude. And so the morning that I got the call for my dad, when he had his heart attack, my brother, was it my brother? Yeah. I got a call from the hospital, and because my dad worked at the hospital, and then he was an ER nurse, but he had switched over to this methadone clinic downtown in Cincinnati. And I get a call.
He was doing this to help people. That's why it was at the. Oh, wow. I see that.
I can tell you a story about his funeral was crazy. So I'll tell you, I got to tell that story too. So it's funny. So anyway, the day I got the call, I get a call I had just woken up. I had just come back. So I had surgery. I had a surgery on my knee in Vegas on the I think 4th of January. And then I went in the 5th or something. I went in for post-op, and anyway, and then flew home on the 6th. And then I was supposed to meet my dad on the 7th for like breakfast or something like that. And I called him and I was like, hey dad, I'm like, I just flew back, had this surgery, not feeling good, man. Like, can we get together tomorrow or something? He's like, yeah, sure. And then the next day my dad passed away. So that morning I get the call. They said your dad had a heart attack. And so my brother was working on a house nearby me. And so I call him, I'm like, dude, I'm coming to pick you up. And so we jump in the car, and I'm headed downtown. I live on the north side of Cincinnati, and I'm like in the shoulder, going around traffic, driving just stupid. When I get to the hospital, and fully thinking like I'm going to be like, Dad, man, how many times have I told you? You got to get back in the gym. You got to live this healthy lifestyle and all that kind of stuff. And then unbeknownst to me, the heart attack took him. And so, I was like, and when I got there, my dad, I knew some of the nurses at the hospital where he worked. And, I walk up, my dad's buddy, Mike, greets me, and I'm like, hey, Mike, where's my dad? And he's like, he's gone. And I'm like, okay, well, where'd you guys take him? And he's like, no, he's gone, Rich. I'm like, I get it, but where is he? Cause now I need to go there. And he's like, no, like, I don't think you understand. He's gone. And I'm like, oh Lord. So yeah, I mean, fortunately at that point, like they allowed, because we knew the hospital staff, they allowed us to go into the room where they were keeping my dad, and I was able to spend some time with him. But yeah, when my dad passed away, like at his funeral, he was working at the methadone clinic. So the doctor that was the head doctor at that clinic calls me and he says, hey, some of the patients here are asking if they can come to your father's funeral. And, what do you want me to do about that? And I was like, give me a day to think about it. Cause I was like, man, I don't want a bunch of like drug addicts and stuff like that running around my dad's funeral. And so after I thought about it, I'm like, you know what, if people want to come and pay their respects, then I want them to be able to pay their respects. So I was like, I called him back. I'm like, yeah, go ahead and let him come. And then when I got there, it was probably the best decision I ever made, because my father was like one of the most impatient, hard, like rule with an iron fist kind of men that I know. Like he was like, he was just like that traditional, like rub some dirt on it, get back in the game. I'm going to bust your ass, boy, kind of like mentality. And if I was working on a car with him on a Saturday morning in the freezing snow, I couldn't hand him the wrench, whatever, the 3/8 socket fast enough as I'm fumbling through these things. Like he was that guy. And these patients at the hospital, when they were talking about my father, they were like, hey man, I'm sorry for your loss. Like, people come up to me and they said, I just want to say like your dad was a really great man. I'm like, yeah, thanks. So like he was so patient and kind. And I was like,
alter ego.
They're like, yeah, they was like, listen, I would come in every day and I would tell him the stories and he would just sit and listen to my stories. And he would always offer the best advice. And I was like, that guy. And like, yeah, and time again, like there was a dozen of these patients that showed up and they tell me these stories. And I was like, I'm looking at him. I'm like, who are you? Like, how come I didn't know this guy? And so it's amazing, like the unique interactions that people have with a person. And so, honestly, oddly enough, on my father's, like as my father's funeral, I got to know him a little better than I ever realized that I knew him before, because patients tell me about how he would bring gifts in and do things for them on their birthdays and all this kind of stuff. And I was literally like, this just does not add up.
I mean, it's really interesting because to go back to school in like your 40s or mid 40s or whenever and go to a bachelor's degree, it takes so much humility and desire to just want to be better. It's so hard, by the way, to do, just for the audience. I've thought so many times to go back to school to do my PhD because I stopped after my master's degree and I just can't do it. I keep telling myself, oh, you're in your 30s, you're older. The kids are going to be 20 in your class. They're going to look at you funny. And your dad actually went in his 40s. And to do that, you have to have crazy motivation. So I bet you two were like on a path sort of together. And I guess he wanted to live a life of meaning because he clearly wouldn't choose a methadone clinic for any other reason.
No, well, initially my dad was an ER nurse and he liked the adrenaline of the ER. He had some great stories about the ER and he really liked that. But then eventually it just kind of wore on him. And I think that for reasons
I hear that, yeah.
other than adrenaline, but he ended up going to the methadone clinic, and somewhere in my dad, oddly enough, which I never kind of took him as maybe an empath or something like that, but he was the kind of guy that I guess that really did want to help people. And I say that, and I should kind of like strike that comment, because my dad was the kind of friend that if you said, hey, Rick, I need my brakes changed. Can you come over and help me change my brakes? Like he would, when he didn't have time, he would sacrifice a Saturday afternoon when there was 6 inches of snow on the ground and come over and change your brakes for you. And he would complain the whole time he was doing it, and he would yell at me for not handing him the wrenches. but he would definitely do that. So he's always been that kind of guy. But
Rich, can you give our younger listeners some advice about, because the position you face is really interesting. You I guess to some degree your father was your hero. You respected him a lot, and you had went through schooling to a master's degree, so 6 years of schooling, or at least 5 years, and you decide I don't want to live the life of the keeping up with the Joneses or whatever the hell this bland lifestyle is going to get myself into. I want to go for something I love. I don't know if I'll succeed. Now, I trust my father's opinion. My father tells me you're not going to succeed. It's a bad idea. But you still decide to go about doing it. How would you advise younger listeners who may also respect their parents may be advising them to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, and they may love something like nutrition or something else that's their genuine interest? How would you advise them to go for what they love? How should they think about it? How should they decide if it's really worthwhile, if I won't regret it, and so on? And how should they manage their parents too?
I asked this. I had a guy by the name of Billy Allsbrooks on my podcast, who was an aspiring hip hop artist in the late 90s and early 2000s, and he had reached like the top 20 billboards with a couple of his hits. And I asked him, and then he ended up born again Christian. And so I asked him, I'm like, how do you measure success? Like, how do you measure success? And he gave me like one of the most profound answers. He said, I measure success by how well I'm living the purpose by which God has put me on this planet, how I'm fulfilling this purpose in life. So what is that purpose? And I think that for me, there was a very significant point in time in my career as a math teacher where I would bring my Bible to school, and I would oftentimes, if I didn't have on my plan bill, if I didn't have like tests to grade or lesson plans to do, like if I was caught up, I would just sit and read my Bible, which is very odd to people in this modern day society. Like, what, you like reading the Bible? That's crazy. But I actually really do enjoy reading my Bible. And I had a student that walked in during my plan bill one time, walked into the teacher's lounge and had to, I don't know, pick up copies for another teacher or something like that. And he sees me, he walks by, he's like, "Hey, Mr. Franklin, what are you reading there?" I said, "I'm reading my Bible." And he's like, "What are you reading?" And right at that point, I had this thought in my head, like, this is that moment where that separation of church and state mentality could make me lose my job. And so I remember at that point in time saying, like, man, like I prayed about it. I was like, God, if I had a job where I could impact lives and people, you know, teenagers and whatnot, like I would use it to glorify you. And so lo and behold, I ended up becoming a fighter. Now, did God say, "You know what, I want to make you a fighter"? I don't think it necessarily worked that way. It was like, I decided what I wanted to do, and God was like, "All right, listen, this is what you want to do. And you said that you would use this in a way to glorify me. So you hold up your end of the bargain, and I'm gonna hold up my end of the bargain." And I believe that, like, he opened doors for me that caused me to be successful.
Well, so you approached fighting as God's mission for you, sort of.
No.
I'm not. No. I mean, you asked God to make you a tool in his for him, and then you ended up in fighting. But why I'm saying this is this. So you had a particular persona when you were a fighter. You were not a bad mouth or bad talker to other people. You didn't try to cause drama. Was this all like limited by your Christian morals and how you wanted to carry yourself? Like that football player we were talking about was always humble when he won. What guided that? And can I ask you about this? Can you do what you did back then today if you were a fighter? Could you be as much of a nice guy and, you know, so low key, or do you need that kind of drama for the young fighters today?
Oh yeah, people always say to me, like, "Man, you missed the boat." Like if you were like, I was like the NFL players of the 1960s and 70s, like right before these like bigger money contracts started coming. Like, you missed the boat on that. And I think, like, no, I don't think I would stand out in today's landscape of fighters, because I didn't create a persona. It's just who I am as a person. And so I always tell people, like, you as an athlete, like, you need to create a persona, but you need to create a persona that's true to who you are. Now, for me in the UFC, I was that boy next door, American pie eating, bring home the kid, good old fashioned red blooded Midwestern, you know, boy. And with Christian values. And it wasn't a role that I was playing. It's just who I was. Fortunately for me at the time, the UFC also needed that. They needed it because I was speaking to athletic commissions from state to state. And the landscape at that time was like, man, all MMA fighters are like these tattooed up, bar brawling, beer drinking, you know, whatever, trouble causing societal members. And suddenly it's like, no, wait, look, we got this guy here. He's smart. Like, smart people do this too. This guy's a math teacher. Wow. And so that role was perfect for me because it's who I was. Now I do not want to paint the picture that I'm perfect human being here, man. Like if we were all airing out our sins here, I'd be like, man, I'm going to keep these doors closed. But no, like, for me, fortunately, that's what the UFC needed. So it played very well into who I was as a person. And so in this modern landscape, I don't know if I would be as successful because I don't think I could create. I mean, I might be able to create a character where, because I don't know, to flip the script here, like if you were ever playing basketball with me on the court, man, I will run my mouth the whole time. I'm not even that good at basketball. I'm going to run my mouth because my whole philosophy is like, I'm just going to, like, if I can just get in your head, then that's just one more factor to help me win. So, you know, like, but I do it more for fun. So I think if I was in this modern landscape, maybe I would create a persona a little bit, maybe possibly trash and talk a little bit, but it would just be more for fun. You also didn't. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think a good comparison would be a Stipe Miocic, the former UFC the heavyweight champion, the greatest heavyweight champion in UFC history with the most title defenses. And also a guy like Chris Weidman, also former UFC champion. And I think these two athletes they're good men. They're someone you want to be your neighbor. They're not tattooed. They don't really say bad things. They're more of a Rich Franklin style athlete. And these two guys struggle to get fights. They have to beg the UFC. They have to go on social media to try and like ask the UFC to make their negotiations public. just to get on a damn fight card. Stipe Miocic should have gotten immediate rematch against Francis Ngannou. They didn't give it to him. They're giving Ngannou, they're creating interim title belts for more flamboyant fighters, in my personal opinion. So they're pushing less skilled athletes that have maybe a greater social media Q rating instead of a hard-working, these blue-collar All-American athletes. It's kind of the way I envision them. Stipe Miocic is a firefighter, still actively working.
An Ohio guy.
Fair enough.
Us Ohio guys, man. It's like
Ohio genuinely, when I visited Ohio, the nicest people I've come across, the most friendly people. I love that state.
I think just putting it out there, a guy like Rich, who one of the greatest athletes of all time, UFC Hall of Famer, 3-time UFC world champion, right? God, average people don't get that. Average elite athletes don't get to the level that a Rich Franklin got. But I agree, you would have, in the current climate of social media, Jake Paul influenced prize fighting, there would have been a struggle and a maybe a moral struggle even with you in order to get your Q rating higher, to get the fights that you truly deserved on athletic merit. Would you have had to change your whole persona and not focus so much on the in-gym, the workman-like, concept that you had built your whole career to get to that point, to even get that first title shot or to move forward to develop?
I would, and it would be tough for me because if you guys look at my social media, for example, I'm a kind of person, you asked me about being in the moment. I'm definitely a person who's learned how to live to be in the moment. I'm not the guy who's on a snowboarding trip that's like, man, I should record this for social media. Like I have to constantly be reminded. So I'm like this, man, these slopes, check this out. This is awesome. Right. And when I go to do a workout, I'm there to get work in, man. I'm there to do my deal, not like let me make sure I get this set so I can post it. I posted a set of me. I don't know if you saw Dolce, a set of me doing the 315 for 25 reps the other day. And that was on the back end. That was on the back end. No.
Humble brag.
Deadlifting, not benching.
Hey, still, buddy, that's no joke, man. That's no joke.
Well, but that was on the back end of a leg workout, and that was my last set of deads. And I'm like, okay, let me see. I'm thinking I might be able to hit 365 for 25, maybe.
I remember when briefly we were traveling with the military, and we had like 40 minutes to squeeze in a workout, and you're like, yeah, I think I'm just gonna do like maybe 225 for sets of 20. I was like, you're fucking crazy, bro. That's on a squat, barbell back squat. Sets of 20. I mean, these are breathing squats, death squats, as they're known to be. And this guy's squeezing them in, getting off an airplane, about to go speak to the military on motivation. I was like, fuck it, you're making us all look bad, Franklin. Calm down here. Do a little fluff and pump. Let's, get the biceps swollen. Let's go put on a show.
There's nothing more unpleasant than a 20 rep squat that you can only do 10 reps of. And so you have to breathe in between each.
No, I'll tell you what's more unpleasant than a 20 rep squat is a 21 rep squat. And then what's more unpleasant than a 21 rep squat is a 22 rep squat.
Well, you've went above 20? I've never tried to do that. Oh my God.
Yeah. There was a contest at my gym. The guys at my gym were doing your bot, like you load onto a bar, your body weight. So for me, like right now I'm weighing 225. I'll put 225 on the bar. And they were training and working up to 100 reps, 100 reps of body weight. And there was a couple guys in the gym that actually did this. There's this guy at our gym. He was 265 at the time, loaded up 265 and did 100 reps. 100 reps with breathing breaks, but never racked the weight and took it off his back. 100 reps.
Wow.
So, there are apparently genetic polymorphisms that make some people produce less lactic acid in the muscle. And also other people produce the same amount, but don't sense it as much.
So I think for me as an athlete, I think this is like when you talk about athletic skills, remember, I mentioned before, like I grew up playing football. So from the time I was 8 years old to the time I was 18, I played this sport, but you need very explosive, like muscle fibers and things like that. And I didn't have the speed. Like my speed in high school for a split end for a guy who only weighs 155 pounds was like 4.81 or something like that. It was like, which is not fast enough to be playing football, particularly at that weight. And so I think that what I have is that, like, when Dolce talks about me doing sets of 20, it's like I have the ability to do repetitive sets of 20 over and over and grind through that. So I'm this like I'm that kind of athlete where that's why when you see me, if you were to analyze my fight style, like I typically start off kind of
slow.
First and second rounds, or the first round, and then my pace just continues to pick up. And part of that is me increasing in pace, and part of that is my opponent dropping off, because I don't fatigue the way that other people fatigue, and I have that ability to just grind. And that's why I think this sport was perfectly suited for this sport. Who was it that gave that TED talk on athletes? Doug Epstein, Dr. Epstein. He gave a TED talk, and he compared the Olympic runner, the Kenyan who won the Olympic, the gold medal in the marathon, to Michael Phelps, and how mechanically they're just completely different, like leg length, arm span, all that kind of stuff, but they're the same height. And so how one is basically like Phelps has been genetically engineered, and I will use the term engineered because that means that there was a design element behind it, compared to the Kenyan runner who was genetically engineered for a completely different sport. And they found success in those two sports respectively because we end up gravitating towards what we do well. And so this sport was something that aside from the learning curve I have in martial arts and my ability to exponentially pick up information and execute it, I had athletically this ability to just grind through 15 or 25 minutes or whatever it was.
I don't want to glimpse over something. Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I think maybe on another show, I love to delve deeper into this, deeper conversations. We focus a lot, specifically when I was working with these higher level glycolytic athletes, we focused on deflection point with relation to heart rate and the ability, and it's more lactic acid training threshold, the ability to get athletes to improve their deflection point, the rate at which their heart is racing. Now, what we can do, and I think to Rich's point, he could slowly scale up, and then get faster as it feels like towards the end. But at the same time, it's the maintenance of relative pressure per se, or of heart rate, and the inability or the ability for the body to suppress that deflection point, while the other athlete cannot. So the other athlete all of a sudden starts to decline as you're able to maintain a relative output, and that's something that we train very specifically here, or we used to, more specifically, where we would do treadmill runs and we would slowly scale up the athlete. Now you can do it if you're actually, pulling blood the entire time. That's a very difficult way to do it, but you can do it in another way. As an aside, deeper conversation, 3-hour conversation with speaking. The ability of the athlete, we get the athlete running on a treadmill, starting off walk, half mile, slowly getting up to a nice jog. And we would have a conversation. I'd say, keep talking, keep singing. I used to work with WWE athletes, very similar. They would be forced to train and talk it the entire time because that was part of their game. They would have to hit their spots. So to finish this, once the athlete takes that deep breath, typically you can see the deflection point and you can see performance dramatically dump. And this is because their body can no longer provide enough oxygen into the bloodstream to clear the lactic acid, if you will, much deeper biochemical responses. But someone like Rich might have that genetic ability. Maybe you don't have that super fast twitch 2X muscle fiber type, but at the same time, you have the ability to push that deflection point higher, where maybe your relative ability is 80% to someone else's 100%, but you can stay at 80% for 25 minutes. They can only touch 100% for 2 and drop back down to 70%, but never be able to reclaim back up again. It's very interesting. This is something we use very successfully with our athletes.
Yeah, I'm very interested. I want to research, actually. I'm making some notes to research. Like, for example, I'm going to research the neurochemistry of indecision, because there's a lot of papers on this subject, and it's a very interesting one. The other thing I want to research is, you mentioned that the body uses the oxygen from the blood to get rid of the lactic acid buildup. I don't actually know the process of that. I want to research it.
There's a great book, and this was pivotal to me, Leo. You'll love it. It was by Dr. Peter Janssen, I believe PhD Janssen, called Lactate Pulse Rate Training. Oh. This is a book. It's very hard to find. I know I have a copy. I'll grab it here in a minute just to show you. It's beat the hell. This changed my career as a coach. And this took me from a good coach to an elite coach. It was my ability to understand energy substrates very specifically with regards to the athletes I was training, because I have the nutrition background. So I understood the fueling, the nutrition, but to apply the training style to fit the nutrition relative to the energy substrate necessary for performance. And we understand the athlete needs a variety of energy substrates to pull from for very specific activities at very specific times, right? That big, 12 second to 20 second all out burst, right? That creatine phosphate system, that one big burst, but then you're out within 20 seconds or so. You cannot do that. Now what happens? What system do you then default back into, and can you then maintain that? Also, the aerobic base, which many elite athletes are severely undertrained aerobically, which is odd because they're always training glycolytic, go, assault bikes, air dynes, battle ropes, go. But they neglect the aerobic system, the longer walks, the hiking, the light jogging, the low intensity. They neglect that. They don't have that wide aerobic base. Therefore, they cannot build that higher glycolytic pyramid. That pyramid, because the aerobic base is smaller, they cannot then reach that same height glycolytically, and they cap out. Although their relative rate of exertion is as high, their pyramid will never be as high as someone with the aerobic base. And that's something that they often miss. So deeper conversations again. But
guys,
pulse rate training. Yeah, I think you'll love it, Leo.
I will. I wrote the book down also, and I'll ask you more about it later. But I just realized, guys, it's been 2 hours. I've never had a podcast go 2 hours, and I didn't notice. I really apologize. I know, Rich, you have a little time on your hands. Maybe we'll leave with one more subject, but I got to tell you something, Rich. I didn't even get to the Anderson Silva part, and then the remainder of your amazing career. I had a lot more questions. And then after that, I actually had some general questions, which I thought, honestly, the audience will find much more interesting. General questions about subjects regarding fighting. But maybe we could have you again on sometime in the next few weeks or a couple of months if you have some time free.
That's how interesting I am. You've gone 2 hours with me and you're like,
it's true. No, really, because
I did the same thing for Dolce. I did the same way Dolce on my podcast too, man. We talk for like an hour and a half, and typically I cut mine off at an hour anyway. And I'm like, man, I don't want to talk for 2 hours with him, 3 hours, and then miss it's like all this good information that just ends up like on the cutting room floor.
I usually cut mine at an hour also. I'm shocked like this 2 hours. We'll leave with one note just because you guys just brought it up. So we were talking about, Mike, you were saying that there were two competitors right now who aren't getting the fights that they can get because they're not loud and they're not maybe dramatic and so on. Is there a chance that the UFC can get to the point, to both you and Rich, where the best actual fighters are not getting the chance at title fights because they're not valuable to watch for the common viewing audience? And particularly in light of the Jake Paul, Logan Paul era, which, by the way, they're also from Ohio, interestingly.
Yeah. So, okay, let me answer that question. Part of the reason why I moved up to 205 at the time is because after I lost my second match to Anderson Silva, the matchmakers of the UFC said, we're not interested in doing this match again. So what they did not want me hanging out in the middleweight class, clearing out all the competition, staying as the number one contender. And it's no good for the weight class. So I was stuck as like a Ronin in the middle of like, well, what do I do with my career? And unfortunately for me, I was never big enough to fight at 205. When I weighed in against Forrest, when the two of us weighed in, I was looking at him eye to eye, I swear it. And then when we stepped into the cage, like when he rehydrated, his spinal cord rehydrated or something because he grew another 1.5 2 inches. I was looking up at him like, what did you do?
I've heard you say that.
Right. And so
he was coming down from 240 Forrest was.
Yeah. And so, so when I stepped into the cage that night, I probably weighed it was 205 fight. I may have weighed 210 tops. And he was close to 240, and that's a lot of weight to give up. And that's what ended up costing me that fight, because Mazzagatti was refereeing that, and I made a strategic decision to not get up in the first round, like to not try to push force off me, because he was so big and heavy, and I didn't want to blow. You're talking about that ATP. I didn't want to blow that, just hit that initial blow load in the first round and be stuck. And he was so big on top of me. I thought, like, I'm just going to tie him up, not take any damage here. We'll get stood up. Mazzagatti never stood us up. This is a big reason why I'm not a fan of the 10-point must system in MMA, because you only have 3 rounds. And I think when you, like in one championship, we judge the fights in its entirety. So the whole fight is judged as like one big round, and you just pick up where you left off. And so when you look at that, it's like, well, I've already lost 1 round, 10-9. And so I'm already in a deficit. So if one of the rounds can go, it's like, well, but if you look at the total performance, it's a different story.
Yeah, there's a lot of differences between one also, that's one of the topics I want to get into with you. So hopefully you'll join us again. I hope I didn't trouble you too much with my excessive questions today.
No. It's good. Actually, you know what? I had to get up for a second because I've had like several of these already today. It's early in the morning. This is my second one. So I'm almost 2.5 liters down. And I was like, man, I've had to pee for like the last 15 minutes. And I was trying, and I'm like, no, I got to cut out for a second and go to bed.
I'm also out of all drinking fluid, so I got to go too. But guys, thank you so much for spending your Friday morning with me. And Rich, it was such an honor to talk to you. I hope that I can convince you somehow to come back on. I'm going to do something, Rich. I'm going to text you on Instagram, because I'm very interested in cardiovascular disease. I spend a lot of my time reading about it and trying to protect myself from it. So maybe I could chat with you, and I know you're perfectly healthy, but there could be some interesting tips or tests I can tell you about to check out, so that you can, because cardiovascular disease is like a lifetime disease. It takes so many decades to build up, and it's so reversible. Like plaque can be reversed in 10 years.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you eat healthy enough that you don't have any worries, but I think I can give you some new ideas though, for sure.
Mike and I have very, very similar nutritional philosophies. By the way, Mike, I've been watching you dropping weight on Instagram, man. It's crazy. I swear sometimes I'm like, he's not standing on that scale. It's insane watching your weight drop like this, man.
It was insane. Going down to 169 though was I should have stopped in the mid 180s, because I was done at that point. And then it became a dog on a bone. It's like, well, fuck, I already dropped 3 weight classes. Ego, maybe I'll just go a little bit farther. And I was like, all right, touchdown, 169, 12 weeks. I thought that would be fun to do. But man, my wife was like, you got to stop. Like, cause it's funny, cause I was telling Leo last time I'd be in the bathroom mirror flexing, tendons running through my abs, like super veiny, just like everything, my legs crazy. And then I'd like walking down Main Street, like right here, my studio. So I go grab a cup of coffee. I walk down Main Street, and you see a reflection in a window. I'd see like the way my face was looking. I'd be like, dude, that guy doesn't look good right there. Like just too sucked out. It was like weight cut face for like 2 weeks.
I just showed somebody a couple of days ago. I don't remember who I was talking to, but I showed somebody a picture of me when I did my last weight cut to 185. And I mean, my eye sockets are sunken in, my cheeks are drawn in. Yeah. I'm sitting there with a pair of shorts on, my knees not stick out like knobs. Like it's just, I look unhealthy.
We got to get into that, I think, next time. That would be fascinating. We haven't discussed that yet on Leo's show here, the weight cutting side. And I think because Leo's a big bodybuilding centric audience, he arm wrestling and stuff too, and then also the biohacking. But I love, especially with you, Rich, I don't think the world understands weight cutting for combat sports. Drying out for bodybuilding is completely different because you have to get damn near as lean, single digit body fat percentage, but you have to fight for 25 minutes on competition day, where most bodybuilders, they can't even stand up straight for 3 minutes of call outs. You have to fight.
But we also, I will say this though, we also have, I mean, look, we could get into the whole discussion of weight cutting, because one championship, we have our hydration system, like we don't allow our athletes.
Yeah, it's one, you guys don't allow it. Exactly. That's another thing I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. And so we use an instrument called a refractometer to test the specific gravity of urine. To see what their hydration levels are as they're making weight. So they have to be on weight and hydrated simultaneously. Now, I've obviously been part of both systems. I've been part of this system on the executive side, but I was part of the weight cutting system on an athlete side. And for weight cutting, as weight cutting goes, I approached weight cutting as scientifically and safely as I possibly could. But at the same time, it's not good for you. I mean, and you probably know this, as the body rehydrates, one of the last places to rehydrate is the brain cavity. So your brain sitting in fluid is now, at a reduced amount of fluid, and which only increases the concussions and the severity of concussions. So, there's a lot of stuff on that. I can talk about how I cut weight, but I will say this, back to your comment, Mike, about the bodybuilding world, is that when I cut weight, I still had 30 hours about from the time I stood on scale to the time I was in the cage. I had about 30 hours to rehydrate. And that was at a time where it was still legal to IV. So I had an entire protocol that I would do with coconut waters, banana, honey, IVs, and all that kind of stuff. So I remember in my Yushin Okami match, when I fought Yushin, I weighed on the scale at 186, went to bed that night at 209.
Wow, interesting. Wow,
I probably ended up stepping in the ring somewhere around 205, but I overhydrated on that fight too. I did too many bags of saline.
So I've listened to you talk about cutting before, and so for the audience, Rich has a background with the Weider principles and all the bodybuilding stuff, and he follows like a 6 meal a day diet even now, but you have like a very rigorous approach to cutting. I noticed that before, and that's one of the topics I want to get into next time. Hopefully we can convince you to come on again. I swear I have many more interesting questions, and they're less like chronological, so they'll be fun to talk about if we can get you on.
It's interesting doing an interview with you. I like the way your brain works. I can tell it's very similar. Like it works kind of similarly to the way my brain does, because you'll take a little note like, okay, I got to anchor on this. And
I have a lot of notes here which we didn't follow up on. That's why I want to do it next time.
That's the whole problem. Well, my problem is I talk too much, right? So what'll happen is I'll give you
connect exciting topics, but you don't delve into them. So you have a main point, but you touch on so many other interesting topics along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
As I give an answer, it's like, here's my main point, but I've touched on these 5 things.
Exactly.
And now you're like, crap, which one of these?
That's exactly what's happening. Okay, I'll let you guys be. Have a great morning, and a wonderful Friday. It's nice to meet you, Rich. Bye-bye, Mike.
Always good seeing you again. Great interview, by the way.
Later, Rich.
Bye-bye.